If you touch him, you're finished," Annie shouted, her voice ringing through the chaos of the room. Mason Briggs slowly turned his head toward her. One hand was still gripping Edward's shirt collar, almost pulling him out of his chair. Edward's silver tie hung loose around his neck, and his white collar was crushed in Mason's brutal fist. His face had gone pale. One hand clutched the edge of the walnut desk to keep himself steady. In Mason's other hand was an iron bar. "What did you just say, little girl?" Mason growled. Annie stood beside the overturned filing cabinet on the floor, both hands clenched at her sides. Mason yanked Edward's shirt harder, making him cough and choke. "And what if I do want to touch him?" Mason said, leaning close to Edward's face. "What if I want to break something before he signs?" Annie took one step forward. "Don't underestimate me," she said clearly. "Let him go. Right now. Otherwise, don't blame me for what happens next." One of the men near the door burst out laughing. He slapped his hand against the wall and looked at Mason. "Boss, you hear that?" he mocked. "This little girl wants to be a hero." Another man chuckled and dragged the tip of his iron bar along the carpet. The dry scraping sound echoed through the clean, luxurious office like a threat. Edward tried to speak, even though Mason's fist was still tight around his collar. "Mason," Edward said, his voice strained with pain, "whatever you want, talk to me. Don't drag Annie into this. She has nothing to do with my son, nothing to do with these papers, and nothing to do with your threats." Mason looked down at Edward, then back at Annie. "You should worry about your own old life first," he said. "After tonight, there may not be much of it left." Then he turned all his attention to Annie. The corner of his mouth curled. "And you are involved now, because you opened your mouth." Annie's eyes flicked toward the tea tray on the small table nearby. The cup had shattered on the carpet, but the tray still held a small teapot, a spoon, a neatly folded napkin, and a puddle of hot tea near the edge. Mason was still gripping Edward's shirt, still smiling, still enjoying the snickers of his men behind him. Annie grabbed the tray and swung it forward. Tea splashed across Mason's jacket and shirt front. It was not hot enough to burn him badly, but it was enough to make him flinch and curse. The tray struck the edge of the desk and clattered to the floor. "I already told you, don't you understand?" Annie shouted. "Let him go." For a moment, Mason looked more shocked than hurt. Then anger flooded his face. The men behind him erupted at once. "You crazy little brat. Did she just throw that at him? You hear what she said?" One of them snarled, stepping closer with his iron bar raised. "Now she's challenging us." Another pointed straight at Annie. "Let me teach her a lesson." Edward tried to break free from Mason's grip. "No, leave her alone. If you want me, deal with me." But Mason did not take his eyes off Annie. He lifted the iron bar and tapped it once against his palm. "You want to look brave?" he said. "Fine. Let's show this whole room what bravery costs." Then, without warning, he swung the iron bar down and struck Edward's hand. It was not hard enough to break bone, but it was enough to send pain tearing through the older man's body. Edward cried out sharply, unable to stop himself. His knees almost buckled, his hand slipped from the edge of the desk. Mason hauled him upright by his shirt, as if he were nothing more than an object. Annie held her breath. Edward's face tightened with pain, but he still did not beg. Mason shoved the stack of documents closer with his elbow. "Are you signing or not?" Edward looked at the papers in front of him. His fingers trembled from the pain. His son's name was there. "No," Edward said. Mason leaned in closer. "Think carefully." "I already have," Edward answered through clenched teeth. "I will not use this company to cover Brandon's crimes." Mason's face darkened. He grabbed Edward with both hands and shook him so hard the chair behind him rolled back and slammed into the filing cabinet. "Shut your mouth," Mason roared. "You don't get to talk about my client like that." Edward winced, pressing his injured hand against his chest. "Your client?" he gasped. "My son hired criminals to break into his own father's office." Mason shook him again, harder this time. Edward's shoulder jerked, and the pain burst through him so suddenly he could not hold it back. "Ah!" The cry rang out sharp and humiliating in the very room where Edward had once commanded board members, investors, and governors. Mason shoved him against the desk and forced a pen toward his hand. "Sign it," Mason said. "You transfer the shares, clear the debt, and your precious company keeps running. That's the deal." Edward stared at the pen as if it were a knife. "No." Mason's jaw tightened. He pressed the pen into Edward's hand. Take it. No. You think I came all this way to listen to you? Lecture me? Edward lifted his eyes. His voice was weaker now, but it still did not tremble. I said no. Mason raised the iron bar again, this time letting it hover close to Edward's wrist. The other men moved in. Eager for the moment everything finally broke, Annie looked from Edward's pale face to Mason's hand, then to the papers spread across the desk. Stock transfer forms, debt settlement documents, emergency voting proxies. Everything had been prepared. Everything was waiting for a signature stolen through fear. Are you all tired of living? Annie said. Mason turned his head. Annie's voice came out clear and strong. Touch him one more time, and every one of you is finished. One of the men laughed, but this time the sound was weaker. Mason sneered. You really don't learn, do you? Annie did not answer. She charged toward him. Grab her, Mason shouted. The man near the door moved first. He came toward Annie with a mocking smile still on his face, as if he only needed to grab her arm and shove her aside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and heavy. He reached for her. Annie lowered her center of gravity. She let his hand slide past where her shoulder had been, caught his wrist, and twisted under his arm in one clean motion. The smile vanished from his face. Before he could understand what was happening, Annie twisted his wrist downward and drove her elbow into his ribs. He choked in pain. She hooked her foot behind his ankle and threw him hard. His body crashed sideways into a chair. The chair flipped over. The man hit the carpet hard. Edward stared at Annie, completely stunned. Mason's grip on Edward loosened slightly without him realizing it. The fallen man groaned on the floor, clutching his arm. His iron bar rolled away and struck the leg of the desk with a dull thud. Annie stood between him and Edward. Her breathing was fast but steady. Her cardigan had slipped from one shoulder. Her intern badge swung against her chest. Mason stared at her, as if the small black girl he had dismissed a minute ago had suddenly become something he could not name. What the hell are you? He muttered. Annie did not look away. I'm the person warning you for the last time, she said. Let him go. Mason's face twisted with anger. Behind him, another man raised his iron bar and stepped forward. Edward saw it before Annie did. Annie, he shouted. She turned just as the man swung the bar down. The iron rod cut through the air and slammed into the edge of Edward's desk, sending papers flying everywhere. Annie stepped back just in time, narrowly avoiding the blow. Mason used that moment to pull Edward close, one arm locked across the older man's chest. Enough, Mason roared. Everybody stop. Edward gasped for air. His injured hand trembled against his shirt. Pain was carved into every line of his face, but his eyes stayed on Annie. Don't, he said quietly. Don't risk your life for me. Annie looked at him. Mason pressed the pen into Edward's hand again. Last chance, he said. Sign it, or I go after the girl. Edward's eyes went cold. Leave her alone. Mason gave a dry laugh. You're in no position to give orders, old man. Edward swallowed and looked down at the documents. In one terrifying moment, Annie understood how the choice was tearing him apart. If he signed, he might save her from getting hurt. If he refused, he could keep his company clean, but put her in danger. Brandon had not just sent men to threaten his father. He had sent them to use Edward's own conscience against him. Edward slowly reached toward the pen. Annie stepped forward. No, she said. Edward looked at her. No, Annie repeated, softer this time, but stronger. He's not signing. Mason's head slowly turned toward her. The man who had been laughing near the door was silent now. The man on the floor was still groaning. The fourth man, who had barely spoken until now, began glancing between Mason and Annie, as if he was starting to realize this was no longer an ordinary shakedown. Mason tightened his arm around Edward. You think dropping one man gives you control of this room? Annie's hand moved toward the pocket of her coat, then stopped. Mason still had Edward under control. Two of the others still had iron bars. The office door was locked. The desk phone had been smashed. The hallway outside was dark and empty. Mason saw her hesitation and smiled. That's right, he said. That's fear. I knew you had some fear in you. Annie lifted her eyes to him. No, she said. That's restraint. Mason blinked. Before he could answer, the man to Annie's right rushed at her again. This time, he was not being gentle. He came at her with both hands, angry and humiliated, trying to drive her down onto the desk. But Annie moved first. She grabbed a loose stack of documents from Edward's desk and threw it straight into his face. Papers exploded into the air. While he blinked in confusion, she drove her knee into his stomach and shoved him backward into the man behind him. Both of them stumbled. One cursed. The other swung wildly and struck the glass wall so hard that a thin white crack spread across it like a vein. Mason shouted something, but Annie had already stepped back. She pinned the fallen iron bar with her foot and kicked it under the desk, out of reach. Then she turned back to Mason, her eyes burning. Edward's voice turned hoarse and urgent. "Annie, stop, please." She heard the fear in his voice, but it was not fear for himself. That made her even angrier. Maybe she had wanted a normal life so badly that she had forgotten even ordinary people had to know where to draw the line, and Mason Briggs had crossed every one of those lines. Annie took one more step toward him. Mason pressed the iron bar against Edward's shoulder. "If she moves again," he said, "he pays for it." Annie stopped. Mason looked at her and smiled, thinking he had found the chain that could hold her, thinking he had finally understood her weakness. He lowered his voice. "Now," Mason said to Edward, "pick up the pen." Edward's face was pale with pain. Slowly, he looked down at the papers, then at Annie. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Annie shook her head once. Edward turned back to Mason. "No." Mason's face instantly burned with rage. Annie's thumb searched for the only raised button on the phone. The gold phone was still tucked inside the pocket of her jacket. It was small enough to disappear in the palm of her hand, but in that moment, its weight seemed heavier than the entire room. Annie took the phone out, but she did not press the button yet. Mason Briggs saw it. His eyes narrowed, but his mouth still held that cruel smile, as if he had not decided whether to laugh first or strike first. "What is that?" he asked. Annie kept her eyes on him. "Your last chance." One of Mason's men near the cracked glass wall snorted. "Boss, look at that. Now the little girl has a toy phone. This just keeps getting better." The man Annie had thrown down earlier struggled to get up from the carpet, one hand clutching his ribs. His face was red with pain and humiliation. He pointed at her with a trembling hand. "That brat jumped me," he growled. "Let me handle her." Annie turned her head just enough to look at him. "Tre." Edward Whitaker was still under Mason's control. His injured hand trembled against his chest. His breathing was heavy and broken. His white shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck, and his face was marked by pain and disbelief. Only a few minutes ago, he had been the most powerful man on the top floor. Now he was being held inside his own office by a thug hired by his own son. But even through the pain, Edward's eyes stayed on Annie. "Annie," he said quietly, his voice tense. "Don't do anything reckless." Mason laughed. "You hear that? Even the old man knows you've gone too far." Annie did not answer him. She glanced toward the desk. The documents Mason had thrown down were scattered across the polished wood. Stock transfer papers, debt settlement agreements, emergency voting proxies. Every page was waiting for Edward's signature. Tea had soaked into the carpet. Broken porcelain lay near the leg of the desk. Reports had been crushed beneath Mason's boots. All of it made Annie furious. Mason shoved Edward down into the chair, but he still did not let go of him. "Sit down." Edward nearly collapsed into the chair. Mason stood close beside him, placing the iron bar across the desk within easy reach. For now, it was more of a reminder than a weapon. "Pick up the pen," Mason said. Edward looked at the pen, then at the stack of papers. His jaw tightened. "No." Mason leaned closer. "You are one stubborn old man. I've been called worse by better men." That answer cost Edward. Annie saw it in the way his shoulders tightened before Mason even had time to get angry. Mason slammed his palm down on the desk so hard the pen jumped. "Do not play games with me." This time, Edward did not flinch. "You don't understand what you're asking me to sign." "I understand perfectly," Mason replied. "Your son owes money. Your son promised papers. And your son said you would rather protect your precious company than watch someone else get hurt." Annie's fingers tightened around the phone. Edward's expression changed. Mason saw it and smiled. "That's right," he said. "This is not business anymore, Mr. Whitaker. This is family." Edward lifted his eyes. "Family does not send armed men to threaten an 18-year-old girl." Mason slowly turned toward Annie. "No, family sends people to make sure old men keep their promises." "I never made any promises to criminals," Edward said. Mason's face hardened. One of the men near the door stepped forward. He was thin, bald, and a silver chain showed beneath his collar. Annie had noticed him from the beginning. He was the impatient one. His grip on the iron bar kept changing. Left hand, right hand, then both hands. He was only waiting for permission to swing it. "Mason," he said, "we're wasting time. Let me scare the girl a little, and then he'll sign." Edward rose halfway out of the chair. "No." Mason shoved him back down with one hand. "Sit still." Annie's eyes sharpened. "Take your hand off him." Mason looked at her again, unable to hide his amusement. "You really do like giving orders. And you really like ignoring warnings." The bald man burst out laughing. "Warnings? From you?" He walked toward her. Edward's voice rang out. "Annie, get behind me." She almost smiled at that. He could barely stand. His hand was swollen with pain. His own son had betrayed him, and still, he was trying to shield her from danger. Annie slipped the gold phone into her back pocket without taking her eyes off the man coming toward her. Mason noticed the movement. "No calls," Annie said. "Then control your dog." The bald man's face twisted. "What did you call me?" He lunged. This time, he did not reach lazily for her. He swung the iron bar low, clearly trying to force her back or strike her legs and make her collapse. But Annie reacted before the swing was complete. She stepped inside the arc of the blow, close enough to make the weapon useless. The heel of her palm drove hard into his chest, and she used his own forward momentum against him. His legs crossed. He lost his balance. Annie caught his wrist, twisted hard, and slammed his arm down against the edge of the conference table. The iron bar fell. He gasped, folding forward. Annie drove her knee into his stomach. He buckled, then collapsed onto the floor beside the broken tea tray. Mason's other man near the door stopped laughing. The man by the glass wall lowered his iron bar a few inches. Even Mason had to take a breath before he spoke. Edward stared at Annie, his eyes wide, as if the young woman who had helped him sort invoices an hour earlier had stepped out of an entirely different life he had never known about. Mason looked at the man on the floor, then back at Annie. "Who taught you that?" Annie picked up the fallen iron bar with 2 fingers, carried it to the far side of the office, and tossed it behind a cabinet. "Someone you don't want to meet." Mason's jaw twitched. For the first time, he truly studied her. Not her intern badge, not her age, not her skin, her stance, her breathing, the way she kept the desk, the door, and Edward in view without turning her head too much. "You're not an intern," he said. "I am an intern." No intern moves like that. No smart criminal breaks into a locked office and thinks a name badge tells him everything. The man near the door muttered, "Mason, something's not right." Mason snapped, "Shut up." But Annie heard the shake in his confidence. Small, but real. Edward tried to stand. "Annie, listen to me. This isn't your fight." She looked at him. "When they put their hands on you, it became my fight. You don't know what Brandon is involved in." "I know enough." Mason slammed his palm down on the desk again. "Stop talking like this is family therapy." He grabbed Edward by the shoulder and dragged him back toward the papers. Edward groaned softly as pain shot through his injured hand. Annie moved half a step. Mason immediately lifted the iron bar and pressed it against Edward's wrist. "One more step," Mason said, "and I break it." Annie froze. Edward closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them again. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Even if you break my hand, I still won't sign." Mason stared at him. Edward continued, every word heavy. "You can hurt me. You can threaten me. You can drag my son's shame into this room, but I will not hand my company over to men who hide behind debt papers and prison bars." Mason's face flushed red. "Your company?" he said. "Rich men like you always say that." "My company. My building. My rules. But when your son came to us, he said he was tired of waiting for you to die before he could inherit it." Edward went completely still. Annie saw the pain spread across his face, and a cold feeling moved through her chest. Brandon did not just want money. He wanted to erase his father from his life. Mason knew he had struck the right wound. He leaned closer to Edward. "That's right. He said you were old, weak, useless, and always in the way." Edward's mouth tightened, but his eyes stayed on the papers. "My son may hate me," he said, "but he still has no right to destroy the people who work for me." Annie heard those words and finally understood why Edward had stayed so late. This was not just paperwork. This was the last line of defense. He was trying to hold a line no one else could see. The man near the door began to look nervous. "Mason, we need to go. The security patrol is about to change." Mason looked at the clock on the wall. His patience was almost gone. He snatched the pen again and forced it into Edward's hand. "Last time. Sign." Edward's fingers closed around the pen only because Mason forced them to. Annie's hand slowly moved behind her back. The gold phone was still in her back pocket. Mason saw her shoulder move. "Put your hand where I can see it." Annie stopped. He smiled. "That's better." The office seemed to shrink. The lights, the glass walls, the silent hallway outside, the city below, everything pressed into one single moment. Edward stared at the signature line. His hand hovered above it. Annie could see the war inside him. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid that refusing would make Mason turn on her. If Edward's courage and Annie's bravery touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done in that room. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about courage, justice, and second chances. "Mr. Whitaker," Annie said. Edward looked up. "Don't sign." Mason hissed. "Shut up." Annie ignored him. "If you sign, they won't stop. Men like this don't leave because they get what they want. They leave when someone makes them too afraid to stay." Mason's eyes narrowed. "And that someone is you?" Annie looked straight at him. "Yes. One simple word. No boasting. No trembling." Mason stared at her, then burst into laughter. "You really believe that?" "I know it." His smile vanished. For the first time, Mason no longer looked amused. He looked offended, as if Annie's certainty itself had insulted him. He lifted the iron bar away from Edward's wrist and pointed it at her. "Then do it," he said. "Make me afraid." Edward shouted, "Annie, don't." But Annie had already moved. She reached behind her, pulled out the gold phone, and held it up where everyone in the room could see. The phone was small, smooth, and strange. The screen was dark. There was no logo. Only one raised button near the center. The men stared at it. The man on the floor coughed and quickly backed away. Mason frowned. "What the hell is that?" Annie's thumb rested on the button. "A door," she said. Mason sneered. "To what?" Annie looked at Edward first. His face still showed pain, confusion, and concern for her even now. Then she turned back to Mason. "To the people you should have feared before you kicked down this door." Mason stared at the gold phone like it had insulted him. For a man who had walked into Edward Whitaker's office with iron bars, locked doors, and 3 men behind him, he suddenly looked unsure what kind of room he was standing in. He did not step back. Not yet. Pride kept his boots planted. But his eyes moved from the phone to Annie's face, then to Edward, then back again. "A door?" Mason said. "Girl, you better hope it opens fast." Annie did not blink. "It will." The man by the glass wall shifted his grip on the iron bar. "Mason, I don't like this." "You don't like anything unless somebody else thinks for you," Mason snapped, but his voice had lost some of its weight. Edward sat stiffly behind the desk, one hand pressed to his chest, the other swollen and shaking near the unsigned papers. He looked at the phone in Annie's hand with the same quiet confusion he had worn when she first took down one of Mason's men. He was trying to put pieces together, but pain and betrayal slowed every thought. "Annie," he said carefully, "what are you doing?" She looked at him, and for the first time since the door had been kicked open, there was a trace of apology in her eyes. "Something I didn't want to do." Mason gave a hard laugh. "Hear that, boys? She's got drama now." The man on the floor groaned, still holding his ribs. "Just take the phone from her." Mason did not move. That was when Annie knew he felt it. Not fear, not fully, but instinct. The same instinct that made street dogs stop before crossing a dark alley. Mason had lived long enough around danger to understand that confidence without explanation could be more threatening than a gun. Annie raised the phone slightly. Mason pointed the iron bar toward Edward's injured hand. "Press that button, and I break every finger he signs with." Edward's face tightened, but his voice came before Annie's could. "You do that, I still won't sign." Mason swung his glare back to him. "You're brave for a man who can barely breathe." "No," Edward said. "I'm tired. There's a difference." The answer landed in the room with a kind of worn dignity. Annie saw it reach even one of Mason's men. the quiet one near the blinds, whose eyes dropped for half a second before he hardened his face again. Mason leaned over the desk. "You think being tired makes you noble? Your son said you'd play the martyr. Said you'd sit there with that sad old face and act like everybody else is dirty but you." Edward's jaw moved once. Brandon's words, carried through Mason's mouth, hurt more than Mason knew. "My son is lost," Edward said. "That doesn't mean I follow him." Mason tapped the papers. "He's not lost. He's waiting for what you owe him. I owe him love. I owe him truth. I do not owe him a company full of people who trusted me to keep their paychecks clean." Annie's grip tightened around the phone. There it was again, the reason she had stepped in. Edward was not protecting a stock price. He was protecting workers whose names Mason would never ask. Drivers, dispatchers, accountants, warehouse supervisors, receptionists, people who packed lunches at 6 a.m. and hoped their insurance covered one more prescription. Annie had seen their faces in the elevators. She had heard them talk about grandchildren, car repairs, bad knees, Sunday church, the Cubs, the weather, and whether their kids would ever move back home. Mason saw only documents. Edward saw lives. That difference mattered. "Enough," Mason said. "We're done talking." He grabbed Edward's wrist and forced his hand toward the signature line. Edward resisted, but pain made him weak. The pen scratched the paper again, leaving another mark. Not a signature. Not yet. Annie took a step. Mason pressed the bar against Edward's knuckles. "Don't." Annie stopped, but her thumb stayed on the button. The quiet man near the blinds spoke for the first time. "Mason, maybe we should call Brandon." Mason did not look away from Annie. "Brandon ain't here. That's my point." The room tightened around that sentence. Mason's jaw flexed. Even his own men were beginning to understand what Annie had understood from the beginning. Brandon Whitaker had sent them into a room and stayed safely out of it. Edward gave a humorless breath. "Of course he did." Mason's face twisted. "You don't get to look down on him. You made him this way." Edward looked up, and the pain in his face sharpened into something harder. "I spoiled him. I excused him. I paid for damage. He should have repaired himself. I did all of that. But I did not make him send armed men after his father." For the first time, Annie heard not just grief in Edward's voice, but responsibility. That was rare. Powerful people often confessed only to mistakes that cost them nothing. Edward was admitting to the root. Not to please Mason. Not to save himself. Because at 50 years old, sitting bruised behind his own desk, he could no longer afford lies. Mason had no use for that kind of honesty. He lifted the bar. Annie pressed the button. A soft click came from the gold phone. That small sound changed the room more than any shout had. Mason froze. The phone did not ring in the usual way. There was no bright screen, no cheerful tone, no delay filled with hope. It connected with a short pulse, then silence, deep silence, the kind that felt occupied. Annie raised the phone between them and turned on the speaker. A man answered. "Miss Annie." 2 words. That was all, but the effect on Mason Briggs was immediate. His face drained so quickly it looked as if the room had taken the blood from him. The iron bar lowered an inch. His eyes widened, not at the phone now, but at Annie, as if her skin, her badge, her cardigan, and her youth had all become disguises falling away at once. The man by the door whispered, "No." The quiet one near the blinds took a step back. Edward looked from Mason to Annie, understanding that whatever voice had just come through the phone was not a secretary, not security, not police. The voice came again, calm and low. "Are you hurt?" Annie kept her eyes on Mason. "No." A pause. "Is anyone touching you?" "Not anymore." Mason's lips parted, but no words came out. The voice changed by almost nothing, and yet the room seemed to get colder. "Who is in the room with you?" Annie did not answer right away. She wanted Mason to have one more second to understand what he had done. He had mocked her. He had called her brat. He had threatened a man who treated her with dignity when he thought she had none to offer. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. "Mason Briggs," Annie said. 3 of his men. They broke into Mr. Whitaker's office. They assaulted him. They're trying to force him to sign transfer papers for Brandon Whitaker. The man on the phone breathed once. "Mason Briggs." he repeated. Mason flinched as if struck. Annie watched him carefully. You know the voice, don't you? Mason swallowed. Miss Annie, don't start. His knees bent slightly. Not enough to kneel, but enough to show that his body was considering it before his pride allowed him. Edward's voice came rough from behind the desk. Annie, who is that? Annie did not turn around. My father. Mason closed his eyes for 1 second. The voice on the phone remained quiet. Put him on. Annie held the phone out toward Mason but did not step closer. Mason stared at it like it was a live wire. Speak, Annie said. Mason wet his lips. Mr. Kane. Edward's eyes widened. Victor Kane. Even a man like Edward, who lived mostly in boardrooms and legal contracts, knew that name. Not from newspapers, not officially, but from the way certain men in Chicago lowered their voices when power turned illegal and old. Victor Kane was not supposed to be real in polite rooms. He belonged to sealed indictments that went nowhere, waterfront rumors, judges who retired early, and men who disappeared from businesses they should never have entered. And Annie Carter had just called him father. Victor's voice stayed even. Why is my daughter standing in a room with armed men? Mason's answer came fast and broken. We didn't know, Mr. Kane. I swear on my mother, we didn't know she was here. This was a private job. Brandon Whitaker hired us direct. He said it was family pressure. That's all. We weren't told about Miss Annie. Annie's voice cut in. You were told about me when I told you to let him go. Mason lowered his head. Yes, ma'am. The shift was so sudden it might have been funny if Edward's hand were not swelling, and the office did not smell of spilled tea and fear. Victor said, Did you touch her? No, sir. I mean, one of my guys tried, but she... Mason stopped himself, glancing at the man still holding his ribs. She handled it. A long silence followed. Then Victor said, Good. The word was not praise for Mason. Everyone in the room understood that. Annie finally looked back at Edward. His face held shock, pain, and something that hurt her more than either. Uncertainty. She had wanted to avoid that look. She had wanted one more week, one more month, of being simply Annie. But the truth had entered the room, and truth never went back outside politely. Victor spoke again. Annie, give me names. Mason's head snapped up. Miss Annie, please. We'll leave. Right now. Nobody else gets hurt. You should have thought about that before you put a bar on his hand, Annie said. Mason looked at Edward. Mr. Whitaker, I apologize. Edward stared at him. You apologize because you are afraid of her father. Mason had no answer. Edward looked at Annie then, and his voice softened despite everything. Are you all right? That almost broke her. Not. What are you? Not. Why didn't you tell me? Not even. How could you bring this into my office? His first question was whether she was all right. Annie swallowed. Yes, she said. I'm all right. Victor heard the exchange. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It held the careful control of a man trying not to reveal too much tenderness in front of enemies. Mr. Whitaker, Victor said, my daughter appears to think highly of you. Edward looked at the phone, then at Annie. She saved my life. No, Annie said. Not yet. Mason stiffened. Annie turned back to him. Where is Brandon waiting? Mason hesitated. Victor said one word. Mason. The hesitation died. River North, Mason said quickly. Private room above a place called the Copper Rail. He's waiting for confirmation and copies of the signed papers. Said he wanted the originals before 9. Edward closed his eyes. The betrayal became more solid with every detail. Not a mistake. Not a panic. A plan. His own son had chosen a place, a time, men with weapons, and a deadline. Victor's voice came through the speaker. You and your men will leave that office now. You will touch no one. You will speak to no one. You will walk out the way you came in and keep your phones on. Before sunrise, my people will find you. If you run, they will find you tired. Mason nodded as if Victor could see him. Yes, sir. And Mason? Yes, Mr. Kane. If my daughter tells me you looked back at her wrong, sunrise becomes optimistic. Mason's face went gray. Understood. Annie lowered the phone but kept the call connected. Mason released Edward fully and stepped back. The sudden absence of his grip made Edward sag in the chair. Annie moved toward him, but she did not take her eyes off Mason's men. "Go," she said. They moved quickly. The man with the bruised ribs stumbled. The quiet one opened the door with shaking hands. The man by the glass wall would not look at Annie at all. Mason was the last to leave. At the doorway, he turned halfway, then seemed to remember Victor's warning and lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," he said. Annie's answer was cold. "No, you're scared." Mason left. The door closed behind him. For a few seconds, the office was still. No shouting. No metal scraping. No boots. Just Edward's hard breathing, the hum of the lights, the distant city beyond the glass, and Victor Kane waiting on the other end of the phone. "Annie," Victor said, "I'm here. Do you need me there?" She looked at Edward, at the broken cup, at the papers Brandon had sent into this room like a weapon. "No," she said, "not yet." Victor understood her well enough not to argue immediately. "This is not finished. I know. Call me back in 10 minutes. "I will." "And Annie?" "Yes?" His voice lowered. "You did well." She ended the call before that could hurt more than it should. Then she turned to Edward. The billionaire was staring at her with 1,000 questions in his eyes, but when he spoke, all he said was, "Your hands are shaking." Annie looked down. He was right. The gold phone trembled in her palm. Edward Whittaker looked at Annie's shaking hands, then at the gold phone, then at the door Mason Briggs had just walked through. For a man who had spent half his life reading balance sheets, contracts, and the faces of people trying to take something from him, he seemed unable to read the young woman standing in front of his desk. Annie slipped the phone back into her pocket. "I'm sorry," she said. Edward gave a short, painful breath. "For what?" "For bringing that name into your office." He looked almost offended by the apology. "Annie, 4 men broke in here with iron bars. My son sent them. I'm having trouble blaming you for the part where they left. That should have made her feel better. It did not." She moved around the desk and reached for the bottle of water near his monitor. The cap was too tight for a second because her fingers would not settle. She forced them to. Then she opened it and handed it to him. "Drink slowly." Edward took the bottle with his good hand. His right hand was swelling across the knuckles where Mason had struck him. A purple line had already begun to rise under the skin. Annie saw him try to hide the pain. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Pretend it doesn't hurt." He paused, then gave the smallest nod. "It hurts." "Good, that means you're still honest." A weak smile moved across his face and disappeared. He took a drink, then looked toward the scattered papers. "Those documents. I'll get them." "No, don't touch them yet." Edward's voice steadied. "Fingerprints." Annie stopped with her hand halfway to the desk. That one word brought the room back into order. Not safety, not peace, but order. Evidence mattered. The broken cup, the smashed phone, the cracked glass, the papers Mason had handled, the pen forced into Edward's fingers, all of it had to remain as close to untouched as possible. "You're right," Annie said. Edward leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. His breathing still sounded rough. Annie looked at his chest, then at his color. "Do you have any heart condition I should know about?" His eyes opened. "You sound like my doctor." "Answer the question." "No heart condition. Blood pressure, depending on who's asking." "I'm asking." "Then probably higher than it should be." Annie pulled a chair closer but did not sit. "Stay still. I'm calling building security." Edward shook his head. "The desk phone is gone. I have my regular phone." She took it out, not the gold one this time, and dialed the security desk. The line rang 4 times before a man answered with the slow calm of someone expecting a lost badge. Not a crime scene. "Security. This is Annie Carter on the 48th floor, executive suite. We had an armed break-in. 4 men just left the office. Mr. Whittaker is injured. Lock the lobby exits and call 911. The guard's voice changed. "Say that again?" "Armed break-in. 4 men. Iron bars. They may still be in the building. Lock the exits and call 911 now." There was a beat of panic, paper shifting, a chair scraping. "Yes, ma'am." "Is Mr. Whittaker conscious?" Edward reached for the phone. Annie held it away. "He's conscious," she said. "Send medical up with security. But tell them not to touch the papers on his desk." Yes, ma'am. She hung up. Edward studied her. You've done that before. Given instructions? In a crisis. Annie looked toward the door. I've been around men who create them. He did not ask more. Not yet. She respected him for that. For a few seconds, they listened. Far below or far away, some alarm system changed its tone. A soft lockdown chime came from the hall speakers, followed by a calm, recorded voice asking all personnel to remain where they were. The building had finally realized something was wrong. Edward stared at the door. Brandon is waiting at the copper rail. Annie nodded. That's what Mason said. He chose River North. Edward's laugh was hollow. Private room, probably with a drink in his hand, waiting for men with blood on their coats to bring him my signature. Do you think he knew they would hurt you? Edward did not answer right away. That was answer enough. Annie pulled another chair closer and sat across from him. The desk between them looked like a battlefield made of paper. She wanted to ask whether he was afraid. She did not. Men like Edward were not always allowed to answer questions like that honestly, especially in front of someone young enough to be their child. Instead, she said, you don't have to decide everything in the next minute. Yes, I do. No, you don't. You have to breathe. Keep your hands still. And not blame yourself for someone else's choices. That made him look at her. My son hired them, he said. That did not happen in a vacuum. No, but he is 28. He's old enough to know what a locked door and an iron bar mean. Edward looked down at his injured hand. When he was 8, he used to wait outside my office with a baseball glove. I was always on a call. Always just 5 more minutes. He swallowed. Some fathers lose their sons by leaving the house. I may have lost mine while sitting 10 feet away. Annie did not soften the truth by rushing to comfort him. She had heard too many adults use childhood wounds as permission slip. Woodgistery, woodgistiide, was Brandon might have been lonely. He might have been spoiled. He might have been angry at a father who worked too much. None of that excused what had happened tonight. My mother used to say pain explains people, Annie said. But it doesn't excuse what they do with it. Edward looked up. Your mother sounds wise. She was. The word came out flatter than Annie intended. Edward heard what was underneath but did not press. The elevator chime sounded down the hall. Annie stood immediately and moved between Edward and the office door. Edward noticed. You still think they might come back? I think scared men do stupid things. The door opened carefully this time. A uniformed security supervisor appeared first, both hands visible, eyes wide when he saw the damage. Behind him were 2 guards and a woman from the building's medical station carrying a red kit. Mr. Whitaker, the supervisor said. Sir, are you all right? Edward started to stand. Annie turned. Stay seated. The supervisor stopped, surprised by the authority in her voice. Edward almost smiled despite the pain. She's right, he said. I'm staying seated. The medical attendant came in, stepping around broken porcelain. I need to look at your hand and check your blood pressure. Edward nodded. The papers on the desk are evidence. No one touches them. The security supervisor glanced at Annie, then at the smashed phone. Chicago PD is on the way. Lobby is locked down. We're reviewing cameras. Start with the service elevator and the parking garage, Annie said. They knew how to reach this floor after hours. Somebody gave them access or codes. The supervisor looked to Edward for confirmation. Edward's face hardened. Do what she says. That was the first time anyone in the room looked at Annie as if her words carried official weight. She did not enjoy it as much as she thought she might. Authority born from violence always tasted bitter. The medical attendant wrapped Edward's hand gently. He winced once but stayed quiet. You'll need an X-ray, she said. Later. Sir. Later, Edward repeated. Annie stepped closer. Mr. Whitaker. He looked up. Don't make me agree with your doctor and Mrs. Alvarez in the same night. A tired sound escaped him, almost a laugh. That would be a terrible alliance. Then let them take you when the police finish the first questions. He held her gaze, then nodded. Fine. The security supervisor's radio crackled. He listened, then looked up. They found footage of 4 men exiting through the East Service corridor 3 minutes ago. One looked injured. They got into a black SUV on Lower Wacker. Plates are partially blocked. Annie's jaw tightened. Mason had followed Victor's order and left, but that did not mean he was safe. It did not mean Brandon was safe either. Edward heard the report and closed his eyes. My son will know soon. Maybe, Annie said. Or maybe Mason is too busy being afraid to call him. The supervisor looked confused. Edward did not explain. Sirens rose faintly from the street below. The sound should have brought relief, but Edward's expression only grew heavier. Police meant reports. Reports meant headlines. Headlines meant board calls, lawyers, shareholders, and Brandon's name dragged into public light. For a father, justice did not arrive clean. It arrived carrying paperwork, shame, and consequences. Annie saw him looking at the documents again. You're thinking about protecting him, she said. Edward's eyes stayed on the desk. I'm thinking about whether there is anything left to protect. There is. He looked at her. The people he could still hurt if you stay quiet. That answer settled over him. He did not like it. Annie could tell. But he heard it. The police arrived with careful steps and serious faces. 2 officers entered first, followed by a detective in a navy jacket with a notebook in one hand. She introduced herself as Detective Laura Hensley and took in the room without wasting words. Who is Edward Whitaker? I am, Edward said. And Annie Carter? Annie raised her hand slightly. Me. Detective Hensley looked at the smashed phone, the broken cup, the papers, Edward's wrapped hand, then at Annie's steady face. All right, she said. Start from the moment they entered. Edward drew a breath. Annie spoke before he could. They came for his signature, but this started before tonight. Edward looked at her, then slowly nodded. Detective Hensley opened her notebook. Outside the glass, Chicago kept moving as if nothing had happened. Cars crossed the river. Office lights blinked on in other towers. Somewhere in the city, Brandon Whitaker was waiting for proof that his father had broken. Instead, the first police report was being written, and for the first time that night, the truth had a place to go. Detective Laura Hensley did not rush Edward Whitaker. She stood near the edge of his desk with her notebook open, watching him the way experienced detectives watched injured people. Close enough to catch a lie, patient enough to let pain speak first. 2 officers photographed the broken cup, the smashed desk phone, the cracked glass wall, the papers spread across the walnut surface, and the dark stain where tea had soaked into the carpet. Edward sat with his bandaged hand resting on his lap. The medical attendant had wrapped it, but the swelling had not stopped. Every few minutes, his fingers twitched as if the pain had a pulse of its own. Annie stood near the window, arms folded, her regular phone in one hand. The gold phone was hidden again, but everyone in the room seemed to feel its absence. Detective Hensley had noticed it earlier. Annie knew she had. Good detectives noticed the thing people put away. So, Hensley said, 4 men entered by force, disabled the office phone, blocked the glass, and attempted to force a signature on these documents. That's correct, Edward said. And you believe your son arranged it? Edward's face tightened. I know he did. That's a serious statement, Mr. Whitaker. I understand. Do you have proof beyond what Mr. Briggs said? Edward looked at Annie. Not yet. Annie heard the weight in those 2 words. Not yet. That was the space between suspicion and law, between a father's heartbreak and a prosecutor's file. Mason's words mattered, but Mason was a criminal trying to save himself. The papers mattered, but they needed to be tied to Brandon. The building cameras mattered, but they only proved the men came and left. Brandon himself had to speak. As if pulled by the thought, Edward's phone began to ring. The sound came from beneath a spill of financial reports near the corner of the desk. Everyone turned toward it. One officer paused with his camera raised. Detective Hensley looked at the screen before Edward reached for it. The name glowing there was simple. Brandon. Edward did not move. The phone rang again. Annie felt the room change. The officers knew enough to stay quiet. Hensley's eyes sharpened, but she did not touch the phone. Edward stared at his son's name as if it belonged to a boy with a baseball glove, not a man waiting above a River North bar for stolen signatures. Let it go to voicemail, Hensley said softly. Edward shook his head. He won't say enough on voicemail. Annie stepped closer. Put him on speaker. Hensley lifted a hand. Mr. Whitaker, before you answer, understand. This may become evidence. Keep him talking. Don't threaten. Don't promise anything. Let him speak. Edward nodded, though his face had gone gray again. Annie moved beside him. You don't have to protect him from his own mouth. Edward looked up at her. I know. The phone rang for the 5th time. He picked it up with his good hand and pressed speaker. Brandon. His son's voice came through fast, irritated, alive with expectation. Finally, why weren't you answering? Is it done? Edward closed his eyes for half a second. Is what done? A pause. Short, but there. Don't do that, Brandon said. Don't play stupid with me. Did you sign? Detective Hensley's pen moved. Edward leaned back, the phone lying flat on the desk between broken glass and unsigned papers. Mason was here. Obviously. Annie watched Edward absorb that word. Obviously. No shock. No concern. No question about whether his father was hurt. Brandon continued. He's supposed to call me, but he's not picking up. Did he leave with the documents or not? Edward's voice stayed controlled. He left without them. Silence. Then Brandon cursed under his breath. You stubborn old man. Hensley's pen kept moving. Edward stared at the phone. You sent armed men into my office. I sent men to make you listen. They hit me. You always exaggerate when you want sympathy. Annie's jaw tightened. Edward's bandaged hand trembled, but his voice did not. They threatened an 18-year-old intern. Brandon let out a cold laugh. That girl? Mason said she was there. Why was she still in your office anyway? You running a company or a charity program? Annie did not react, not outwardly. She had heard worse from men with smaller reasons. Edward leaned toward the phone. Do not speak about her that way. Of course, Brandon snapped. There it is. You'll defend everybody but your own son. Some random intern gets your concern, and I get lectures. You got warnings. You got chances. You got lawyers cleaning up your messes before you were old enough to understand what those messes cost. You mean I got a father who cared more about his public image than his family? Edward's expression broke for 1 second. Annie saw it. So did Hensley. Then he put himself back together. No, Brandon. I cared too much about family. That's how we got here. The line went quiet again. Brandon's voice returned lower. You don't want to do this. I think you already did. Listen to me. Those papers fix everything. The debt disappears. The pressure goes away. Nobody has to know. Who is the debt owed to? Don't ask questions you don't want answered. I'm asking. Brandon breathed hard into the phone. Somewhere behind him, Annie could hear music, low voices, maybe the private room Mason had mentioned. Brandon was not hiding in a basement. He was waiting in comfort while other men did the dirty work. It's complicated, Brandon said. Make it simple. It was a bridge loan. Edward gave a bitter laugh. From gangsters? From people who understand opportunity. For a laundering scheme through shell companies tied to my logistics contracts. Another pause. Longer this time, Detective Hensley looked up from her notebook. Brandon said, You've been digging. I've been cleaning up after you. No, you've been blocking me. You froze accounts. You embarrassed me in front of people who don't tolerate embarrassment. So you sent Mason Briggs. Brandon did not answer. Edward pushed gently. Say it. You want me to say what? That I hired him? Fine. I hired him. I hired him because you refused to be reasonable. I told him to scare you, not put you in the hospital. An officer looked at Hensley. Hensley gave the smallest nod and kept writing. Annie felt the room steady around the admission. There it was. Not all of it, maybe, but enough to put a foundation under the truth. Edward's voice lowered. You hired men with iron bars to scare your father. I hired men to get back what should have been mine. This company is not yours. It will be. No. Brandon laughed, and this time it sounded ugly. You think you can stop that forever? You're 50, Dad. You're tired. Everyone sees it. The board sees it. Investors see it. I'm the future, whether you like it or not. You are not the future of anything I built. You built it for me. I built it for the people who depend on it. Oh, spare me the factory floor speech. You sit in a corner office and talk about working people like you still eat lunch out of a paper bag. You're not one of them anymore. Edward's eyes moved to the window, where Chicago kept glowing beyond the glass. Annie wondered if he was seeing warehouses, drivers, clerks, mechanics, the kind of people Brandon had never learned to count unless they appeared on a payroll report. No, Edward said. But I remember them. Brandon's voice sharpened. You always do that. You turn everything into some moral lesson. You know what morality gets you? Old. Alone. Sitting in an office at night with some intern making you tea. Annie saw Edward flinch at the last word, not because Brandon mocked him, but because Brandon could not understand the decency in that small act. Edward said, She showed more courage tonight than you have shown in years. Brandon scoffed. Who, the intern? Yes. What did she do, call security? Annie looked at Edward. He did not look back, but she could feel the decision forming in him. No, Edward said. She stood between me and the men you sent. Brandon went quiet. Then he said, That was stupid of her. Annie stepped closer to the phone. Maybe, but it worked. The silence on the line changed shape. Who is that? Brandon asked. Annie Carter, she said. You're still there? Yes. You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of. I know exactly what I'm standing in the middle of. A spoiled son, a tired father, dirty papers, and men too cowardly to do their own threatening. Brandon's voice turned cold. You should be careful. Edward reached toward the phone. Do not threaten her. I'm not threatening anybody, Brandon said. I'm explaining reality to a girl who should have gone home when her shift ended. Annie looked at Detective Hensley. The detective's pen stopped for a fraction of a second, then continued. Annie kept her voice calm. Mason already told us where you are. Brandon said nothing. The copper rail, Annie continued. Private room upstairs, waiting on originals before 9. A chair scraped on Brandon's end. Edward leaned forward. Brandon, listen to me. Stay where you are. Call a lawyer. Do not make this worse. Brandon laughed once, but fear had entered it. You've got police there. Edward did not answer. You called the police on your own son? No, Edward said. You called them when you sent men into my office. You son of a... You will not outrun this by blaming me. Brandon's breathing grew louder. The background music faded, as if he had moved into a hallway. You don't know what they'll do if I don't deliver, he said. There it was. The frightened boy beneath the arrogance. Edward heard it too. His face shifted, and for a dangerous moment Annie thought he might soften enough to bargain. Who are they? Edward asked. I can't say. You can. No, I can't. You don't understand these people, Annie almost answered, but she stopped herself. Edward looked at her. In his eyes she saw the unasked question. Do you? She looked away. Brandon's voice dropped. Dad, please. Just sign enough to buy time. We can fix the rest later. Edward shut his eyes. Annie could see the father in him fighting the man who knew better. When he opened them, they were wet but steady. No, son. I spent years protecting you from consequences. Tonight, that ends. Brandon inhaled sharply. You'll regret this. I already do. The line went dead. No one spoke for several seconds. Detective Hensley slowly closed her notebook. That was useful. Edward did not seem to hear her. He sat staring at the silent phone, shoulders bent, as if the call had taken whatever strength Mason had left behind. Annie picked up the phone and ended the call properly. Her hand was steady now, though her chest felt tight. Hensley turned to one of the officers. Get units to the copper rail in River North. Quiet approach. Possible suspect attempting to flee. Possible connection to financial coercion and organized crime. Notify financial crimes and preserve this office as a scene. The officer stepped into the hall to radio it in. Edward looked at Annie. He sounded scared at the end. Yes, he's still my son. I know. That doesn't make this easier. No, Annie said. It just makes it right harder to do. He nodded slowly. And the words seemed to settle on him with the cruelty of truth. Hensley looked at Annie. Miss Carter, I'll need your statement too, including the part where Mr. Briggs left after a phone call. Annie's hand moved toward her pocket. Edward saw it. Detective, he said quietly, before she answers that, you should know she saved my life. Hensley looked between them. I'm not disputing that. No, Edward said. But people hear certain names and stop seeing the person in front of them. Annie looked at him, surprised. Edward's hand shook in his lap. His shirt was torn. His son had just confessed to sending armed men after him, and still he was trying to protect how the world would see her. For a moment, Annie could not speak. Detective Hensley softened her voice. Then we'll start with what happened. Not who anyone's father is. Annie nodded once. Thank you. Outside the office, sirens faded into the city. Somewhere near River North, Brandon Whitaker was learning that money could buy criminals, but it could not always buy silence. Inside the broken room, Edward looked older than he had an hour ago, but he also looked clearer, as if the worst thing had happened and left him with only the truth. Annie sat across from him. For the first time that night, neither of them reached for a phone. Detective Hensley asked Annie to sit, but Annie stayed standing. It was not stubbornness. Not exactly. Sitting made her feel trapped. And she had spent too much of the last half hour watching men try to decide where she belonged. Near the desk, behind Edward, out of the way, on the floor, quiet, afraid. She stood near the cracked glass wall instead, close enough to hear Edward breathe, far enough to see the hallway beyond the open office door. Hensley noticed but did not push. All right, Miss Carter. From the beginning. Annie looked at Edward. You want me to tell it? His bandaged hand rested on his knee. The swelling had spread toward his fingers. He looked tired, more than tired. But his eyes were clear. Yes, he said, tell it straight. So she did. She told Detective Hensley about the quiet office, the tea, the thud in the hallway, the door breaking open. She described Mason Briggs, the iron bars, the smashed desk phone, the papers thrown onto Edward's desk. She repeated the demand. Sign. Clear the debt. Transfer the shares. She said Brandon's name, only when she reached the part where Mason said, Your boy. Edward looked down when she said that. Annie kept going. She described Mason grabbing Edward, striking his hand, forcing the pen toward the signature line. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. The room still held the proof. Broken porcelain, cracked glass, a desk phone in pieces, tea drying into the carpet, Edward's bruised hand. Hensley wrote quickly. And you intervened, the detective said. Yes. How? I told Mason to let him go. One of the officers near the door glanced at the overturned chair, then at the man-shaped dent in the room's sense of order. Hensley followed the glance. And then? One of them came at me. I put him down. Put him down how? Annie's mouth tightened. He reached for me. I moved his arm, hit his ribs, took his balance. You've had training. Yes. What kind? Annie paused. Edward spoke before she had to. Detective, is that necessary right now? Hensley looked at him. When an intern disables two armed men during an assault, I have to ask. I understand that, Edward said, but she is not the suspect. No, Hensley said, turning back to Annie. She's a witness who may have saved your life. I still need the facts. Annie respected that answer. She did not like it, but she respected it. My father made sure I knew how to protect myself, she said. Hensley waited for more. Annie gave her nothing. The detective let it sit, then moved on. The phone call. Mr. Briggs left after you called your father? Yes. Name? Annie looked at Edward again. He met her eyes, and in that moment she understood he would not say it for her. He would not force the name into the room. He would let her choose. Victor Kane, Annie said. The officer near the door stopped writing. Hensley's expression changed only slightly, but Annie saw it. The name landed. It always did. Edward watched the detective carefully. You said we would start with what happened. We are, Hensley said. Her voice stayed even. Victor Kane is relevant because his voice caused 4 armed men to leave a crime scene. He didn't commit the break-in, Annie said. I didn't say he did. No, but people don't usually need to say things like that out loud. Hensley studied her. Fair. That one word softened the air by a degree. The security supervisor appeared at the door, holding a tablet. Detective? We pulled lobby and service corridor footage. Hensley motioned him in. Show me. The supervisor stepped carefully around the broken cup and placed the tablet on the conference table. Edward started to rise, then winced. Annie moved to his side without thinking. Stay seated. He gave her a look. You're getting comfortable giving me orders. You're getting comfortable needing them. A tired smile touched his face. Then both of them looked at the screen. The footage began in the east service corridor. The timestamp read 6:24 p.m. 4 men entered through a door that should have required executive access. Mason walked first. Behind him came the shaved-head man, the heavy one Annie had thrown into the chair, and the quiet one who had pulled the blinds. They did not look lost. They did not test doors. They moved like men who had been told where to go. Hensley leaned closer. How did they get through that access point? The security supervisor swallowed. We're checking logs. Check faster. He tapped the screen and pulled up another window. The door opened with an active executive credential. Edward's face went still. Whose? The supervisor hesitated. Hensley looked at him. Say it. Brandon Whitaker. Edward closed his eyes. Annie felt the blow from where she stood. It was one thing to hear Mason say Brandon's name. It was another to see the system confirm it in clean digital letters. Without emotion, without pity. Hensley wrote the detail down. Can that credential be used remotely? No, the supervisor said. Physical badge tap or mobile credential. Was Mr. Brandon Whitaker in the building tonight? Not according to lobby footage. Then who had his credential? No one answered. The security supervisor changed the video. This one showed the men leaving. Mason moved fast, head down. The heavy man limped, one arm pressed against his ribs. The quiet one kept looking behind him, not toward the office, but toward Mason, as if afraid Mason might fall apart. They exited through the same corridor and disappeared toward the lower service level. They knew the cameras, Annie said. Hensley looked at her, meaning? They kept their faces angled down in the lobby feed, but not in the service corridor. That means they knew which cameras were obvious and which ones they missed. The supervisor frowned. She's right. Edward's jaw tightened. Brandon gave them more than access. He gave them confidence, Annie said. Hensley turned to the supervisor. Preserve every access log, camera feed, elevator record, and visitor record from noon onward. Make a second copy. Nobody from corporate touches it without police present. The supervisor nodded quickly and left. For a moment, the room was quiet except for radio chatter from the hallway. Edward opened his eyes. I used to think giving Brandon access was harmless. He had no official role anymore, but I didn't want him humiliated at the door when he came to see me. Annie said nothing. He looked at her. Say it. What? That I was foolish. You were a father. That's not much better tonight. It's more honest. Edward looked toward the city. His reflection in the glass looked older than the man sitting in the chair. He used my mercy as a key. Annie heard the line and knew it would stay with him. Detective Hensley's phone buzzed. She stepped aside, listened, then turned back to them. Units reached the copper rail. Brandon Whitaker was not in the private room when they arrived. Edward's face tightened. He ran. Possibly. Staff says he left in a hurry after taking a call. We're getting security footage and his vehicle information. Annie thought of Mason leaving the office, pale and shaking. Mason warned him. Maybe, Hensley said. Or Brandon got nervous when his father stopped answering like a victim. Edward's good hand curled into a fist. Where would he go? Hensley asked. Does he have an apartment? Gold Coast. A condo I bought him when he was 24. Gaze? Edward gave a bitter smile. He changed the locks 2 years ago. Any other properties? A lake house in Michigan under a family trust. A storage unit near Fulton Market, if he still has it. He also has friends with too much money and not enough judgment. Hensley wrote it down. We'll start with the condo and the vehicle. Annie's regular phone vibrated in her hand. Unknown number. She looked at it. Edward saw her expression. Who is it? I don't know. Hensley stepped closer. Answer on speaker. Annie accepted the call and held the phone out. For 1 second, there was only breathing. Then a young man's voice came through, tight and angry. You think you're clever, don't you? Edward straightened. Annie did not move. Brandon. His laugh was thin. So the intern has a name after all. Edward leaned forward. Brandon, stop running. Shut up, Dad. The words hit the room with a different kind of violence. Brandon continued. You don't get to preach at me with cops in your office. You confessed, Edward said. No, you trapped me. You hired men to attack me. I hired men to make you listen, and then your little office girl turned it into a circus. Annie's voice stayed flat. You ran from the copper rail. Brandon went quiet for half a beat. You don't know what you're dealing with. I keep hearing that from men who ran away tonight. His breathing sharpened. Tell my father he has until midnight. Edward's face changed. For what? To fix it, to sign, to make the debt disappear. Or, Brandon's voice dropped. Or I start sending people things he doesn't want them to see. Hensley's pen stopped. Edward looked confused for the first time. What things? Brandon laughed softly. Ask your brave little intern what secrets cost. The line went dead. Annie lowered the phone. Edward looked at her. What did he mean? Annie did not answer right away. Because she had heard something behind Brandon's voice. Not just fear. Not just anger. Someone had coached him. Detective Hensley stepped closer. Miss Carter? Annie looked at the dark phone screen. Brandon isn't alone, she said. And whoever is with him knows this isn't only about your company anymore. Edward Whitaker stared at Annie's phone as if Brandon's voice might come back through it and explain itself like a decent son. It did not. The screen had gone dark. The call was over. What remained was worse. A deadline, a threat, and a question no one in the office could ignore. Ask your brave little intern what secrets cost. Detective Hensley looked at Annie first. What did he mean? Annie slipped the phone into her pocket. He's trying to scare me. With what? With the truth. Edward pushed himself straighter in the chair. Pain crossed his face, but he ignored it. What truth? Annie looked at him, then at the officers, then at Hensley. She hated this part. Violence was simple compared to confession. A punch came from one direction. Truth came from every wall at once. My father is Victor Kane, she said. Hensley's expression stayed controlled. The officers did not manage theirs as well. One glanced toward the hallway as if the name itself might bring men out of the elevators. Edward did not look frightened. He looked tired and sad. I know that part now, he said gently. I'm asking what Brandon thinks he can use. Annie folded her arms. People hear my father's name and stop asking who I am. Brandon probably thinks if he exposes me, this becomes a scandal instead of a crime. The headline won't be that he sent armed men to attack you. It'll be that the CEO of Whitaker Global had Victor Kane's daughter working in his office. Edward's mouth tightened. He understood immediately. Board members would panic. Investors would whisper. News anchors would say, organized crime ties. 5 times before breakfast. No one would care that Annie had come in as an intern using her mother's name, that Edward had not known, that she had saved him. Fear had a way of editing facts. Hensley wrote something down. Did Brandon know before tonight? No, Annie said. Not unless someone told him after Mason left. Who would tell him? Annie's answer came too slowly. Mason, one of his men, or someone watching both sides. Edward looked toward the documents. Brandon said until midnight. Hensley checked her watch. It's 7:42. The office seemed to absorb the time. 4 hours and 18 minutes. Enough time for a man to flee the city. Enough time to leak a story. Enough time to destroy evidence or create new lies. Edward stood. The medical attendant immediately stepped closer. Mr. Whitaker, you really shouldn't. I'm done sitting. Annie moved beside him in case his knees failed. They did not, but he swayed once before steadying himself with his good hand on the desk. Hensley said, Where do you think Brandon is going? Edward breathed through the pain. If he's scared, not home. If he's angry, somewhere he feels important. If he's desperate, he looked at the papers, he'll go where the money trail is. Which is, there's a private records room on this floor. Old contracts, board archives, sealed family trust documents. Brandon had no access after I cut him off. But if he still has an executive credential, or someone helping him, he may try to get in. Annie frowned. Why come back here after running? Because he needs leverage. If he can't get my signature, he'll look for something he can trade. Hensley turned to an officer. Secure the records room now. The officer stepped into the hall and radioed the order. Edward looked at Annie. You said someone coached him? Yes. Why? Because the Brandon on the phone was angry, but some of those lines were too clean. Ask your intern what secrets cost. That wasn't panic. That was a message. Hensley nodded slightly. From someone who knows both Brandon's financial mess and your connection to Kane. Annie did not like hearing the two worlds placed in one sentence. The security supervisor came back to the doorway, pale and sweating. "Detective, we have a problem." Hensley turned. "What now?" "Records room access was attempted 3 minutes ago." Edward went still. "By whom?" "Brandon's credential." Annie looked at the hallway. "He's in the building." The supervisor shook his head. "No lobby entry. No garage entry. No elevator record under his name." Hensley's eyes narrowed. "Then someone else has his credential. Or he never left the building system," Annie said. They all looked at her. She stepped toward the tablet still on the conference table. "Mason's men entered at 6:24. Brandon called at 7. Something from the copper rail. Or at least he wanted us to think he did. Did anyone verify he was physically there when that call happened?" Hensley's jaw tightened. "Unit said staff saw him leave before they arrived. That could mean he was there. Or someone was told to say that," Annie said. Edward's face darkened. "Brandon could be upstairs? Or in a service area," Annie said. "Or he has someone inside." The security supervisor swallowed. "We're checking cameras. Don't just check faces," Annie said. "Check dead zones. Check where cameras go dark." Hensley looked at her. "You know a lot about buildings. I know a lot about people who don't want to be seen." No one challenged that. Then the lights flickered. Just once. The office went still again. The hallway outside dimmed, brightened, then settled into emergency lighting. A red strip glowed along the baseboards. The building's calm, recorded voice came through the speaker system. "Attention, temporary power fluctuation. Please remain in your current area." The security supervisor grabbed his radio. "Control, what happened?" Static answered first, then a strained voice. "We lost camera feeds on 46 through 49. Backup is rebooting." Hensley's tone sharpened. "Lock down stairwells. Trying. Some doors are showing manual override." Edward whispered. "Brandon." Annie was already moving toward the door. Edward caught her sleeve with his good hand. "No." She stopped. He looked at her, and this time there was no billionaire in his face, no CEO, no man used to people obeying him, only worry. "You are not chasing him through this building." "I'm not chasing him." "Then what are you doing?" "Making sure he doesn't get what he came back for." Hensley stepped between them in the hall. "Nobody moves alone." "Officer Grant, with me." "Miss Carter, you stay here." Annie gave her a look. "Detective, with respect, your officers don't know this floor." "I do. You've been here a month, and I spent that month being sent everywhere nobody important wanted to go. Copy rooms, storage halls, kitchen corridors, archive alcoves. I know the service turns." Edward looked surprised despite the situation. Annie gave him a dry glance. "Interns see maps, executives don't." Hensley considered that. She did not like it, but she was practical. "You do what I say," Hensley said. "No hero work." Annie looked toward the cracked glass and the broken cup. That rule already had a rough night. Hensley almost smiled. Almost. Edward reached for his desk drawer with his good hand. Annie tensed, but he only pulled out a slim access card on a blue lanyard. "MasterCard," he said. "Physical override for executive archives." Hensley took it. "Anything else?" Edward hesitated, then looked at Annie. "The records room has a side door into the old board lounge. Most people forget it exists." Annie nodded. "I know it." "Of course you do," Edward said. The medical attendant protested again, but Edward ignored her and looked directly at Hensley. "If Brandon is in this building, I'm coming." "No," Hensley said. "He is my son. He is also a suspect who threatened you." Edward's face hardened. "That is exactly why I'm coming." Annie stepped closer. "Mr. Whitaker, you can barely move your hand. I don't need my hand to talk." "You think he wants to talk?" "No," Edward said, "but there may still be a part of him that will listen to me." Annie did not say what she thought. That hope had nearly gotten him killed once tonight. But she understood it. Love did not turn off because someone became dangerous. It only became harder to survive. Hensley made a decision. "Fine. You stay behind me and Officer Grant. You do not approach unless I say so. Miss Carter, you guide. One wrong move, and I send you both back with security." Annie nodded. Edward did too. They stepped into the hallway. The executive floor felt different under emergency lights. The soft corporate glow was gone. The glass walls reflected red strips and shadows. Desks sat empty behind transparent doors. Computer monitors slept in rows. The place looked less like a company and more like a museum after closing. Annie walked beside Hensley, not ahead, pointing once toward the service corridor. Archives are past the south conference rooms, but if someone knows the side lounge, they won't use the main door. Hensley kept her weapon low but ready. Officer Grant moved behind Edward. The security supervisor stayed near the office, whispering into his radio. They passed the copy room where Annie had once sat for 90 seconds on her first day, swallowing the insult of being mistaken for help instead of hired talent. Now the same hallway carried the sound of their footsteps towards something worse than insult. At the corner, Annie raised a hand. Everyone stopped. Voices came from ahead, low and sharp. One was Brandon's. "You said it would be clean," he snapped. "You said he'd sign." Another voice answered, older, calm, unfamiliar. "Your father proved more sentimental than expected." And the girl proved inconvenient. Edward's face changed. Annie leaned closer to the wall, listening. Brandon said, "She's Kane's daughter. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand you should have known who was in the room before you sent animals into it." Hensley looked at Annie. Annie looked at Edward. The older voice continued. "Forget the signature. Get the trust file. If your father won't hand you control, we'll make the board remove him." Edward whispered, "Trust file." Annie's stomach tightened. This had never been only Mason, maybe never only Brandon. Hensley motioned them back against the wall and moved toward the corner. Then Brandon spoke again, and this time his voice cracked. "If he goes to the police, I'm finished," the older man replied. "Then stop thinking like a son and start thinking like a survivor." Edward closed his eyes. Annie saw the pain hit him, but he did not step forward. Not yet. From beyond the corner came the soft beep of a card reader. The records room door unlocked. The soft beep of the card reader sounded too small for what it meant. A lock clicked open somewhere around the corner, followed by the low scrape of a heavy door. Detective Hensley raised one hand, palm flat, telling everyone to stay back. Officer Grant shifted behind Edward, his weapon held close to his chest, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead. Annie stood still, but every part of her wanted to move. The records room was not large, but it mattered. She had been sent there twice during her first month, once to pull old board minutes, and once to return archived insurance documents. It smelled like paper, dust, and climate control. Tall cabinets lined the walls. The side entrance opened through the old board lounge, a room most executives ignored because it had not been renovated in years. If Brandon and the older man were inside, they had chosen the quietest way in. Edward leaned close to Annie and whispered, "There are sealed family trust documents in there. Board succession papers. Voting proxies. Enough to hurt you? Enough to make people panic if twisted the right way." Ahead, Brandon's voice came through the open door. "Which cabinet?" The older man answered, "North wall, third row. Your father's personal trust file should be under WH Family Holdings." Annie saw Edward's face tighten. He recognized the voice now, or at least thought he did. Hensley noticed. "Who is he?" she mouthed. Edward's answer was barely audible. "Martin Vale." Annie knew the name. Not well, but enough. Martin Vale was Whitaker Global's outside legal strategist, the kind of man who appeared twice a year in expensive suits and spoke only to senior leadership. He had white hair, careful hands, and a voice that made bad news sound like procedure. Annie had once held an elevator for him. He had looked at her badge, then asked if she could bring coffee to conference room C. Edward looked sick in a new way. He handled Brandon's restricted shares. Hensley's eyes hardened. A son with access was one kind of betrayal. A lawyer with knowledge was another. Inside the records room, a drawer opened. Brandon cursed. "There are too many files. That is why your father trusted people like me," Vale said. "Move." Paper shifted. Metal rails slid. Annie could picture Vale's long fingers walking through folders, calm as church bells, while Brandon sweated beside him. Edward took one step forward. Annie caught his sleeve. "Not yet. My own lawyer is in there, and he has you exactly where he wants you if you walk in angry." Edward stopped, but the pain in his face did not. Hensley whispered to Officer Grant, "Cover the hall." Then she looked at Annie. Where does the side lounge exit? 2 doors past the records room, back into the south corridor. If they know it, they can loop toward the freight elevator. Can we cut them off? Yes, but not from here without passing the main door. Hensley thought for half a second. Grant. Call it in. Quiet. I want units. At the freight elevator and south stairwell. Grant stepped back and spoke into his radio, low enough that only fragments reached them. Inside, Brandon spoke again. You said the board would move if they saw this. They will if they believe your father exposed the company to criminal influence, Vale replied. A hidden intern tied to Victor Kane, an armed incident in the executive suite, a CEO covering family misconduct. It will not matter what is true at first. Panic moves faster than facts. Annie's stomach tightened. There it was. Brandon's threat had not been random. Vale had shaped it. They did not need Edward's signature. If they could destroy confidence in him by morning, they would make Annie the scandal, Edward the fool, and Brandon the damaged heir trying to stabilize the company. Edward whispered, "He planned this." Annie answered softly, "He planned what Brandon was too angry to plan." Hensley moved closer to the corner and called out, clear and firm. "Chicago police, step away from the files and show your hands." Silence hit the records room, then Brandon's voice cracked. "Dad?" Edward moved before Annie could stop him, but he did not rush around the corner. He stepped into view slowly. One hand bandaged, shirt torn, face pale under the emergency lights. "Yes," he said. "I'm here." Annie stepped out beside Hensley, not beside Edward. She wanted Brandon to see her too. Brandon stood inside the records room with a folder half open in his hands. He was tall, well-dressed, and too handsome in the polished way rich sons sometimes became when no one had made them earn kindness. His hair was mussed, his jacket unbuttoned, and his eyes were wild from being cornered. Beside him stood Martin Vale, calm in a charcoal suit, one hand resting on a filing cabinet as if police interruptions were simply inefficient. Hensley aimed her weapon low, hands where I can see them. Brandon lifted the folder slightly. "This is private corporate property." "Put it down," Hensley said. Vale raised both hands, slow and measured. "Detective, I am counsel for the company." Edward's voice cut through. "Not anymore." Vale turned to him with mild disappointment. "Edward, this is not wise. You lost the right to advise me when you helped my son send armed men into my office." Brandon snapped. "Nobody was supposed to get seriously hurt." Annie laughed once, cold and short. Everyone looked at her. "You keep saying that," she said. "Like there's a polite version of sending men with iron bars." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "You?" "Yes," Annie said. "Me." He looked her over, and there it was again, that same quick judgment she had seen from men all month. Only now it was mixed with fear because he knew whose daughter she was. "You should have gone home," Brandon said. "Your father told me the same thing," Annie replied. "Difference is, he said it because he cared whether I got home safe." That landed. Brandon's mouth tightened. Edward looked at his son. "Give Detective Hensley the folder." Brandon clutched it tighter. "You don't understand. If I don't fix this, I'm dead," Hensley said. "Who are you afraid of?" Brandon looked at Vale. Vale's face did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Annie saw it. So did Hensley. Edward took another step. "Brandon, look at me." "Who?" Vale spoke first. "Do not answer that without counsel." Edward turned on him. "You are not his counsel. You are the man who fed him matches and pointed him at my house." Vale sighed. "You always were sentimental about ownership. Your house, your company, your son. That is why you are vulnerable." Annie watched Edward absorb the insult without moving. This was different from Mason's violence. Mason attacked the body. Vale attacked the meaning of things. Brandon's voice shook. He said if I cooperated, he could restructure everything. Move debt. Shift control. Make the board believe I was protecting the company from you. Edward's face went still. From me. You were going to report me. I was going to force you into treatment, legal counsel, and restitution before federal investigators did it for us. Brandon looked confused for a second, as if mercy sounded foreign when spoken plainly. Vale stepped half a foot toward the side door. Annie noticed. "Detective," she said, Hensley turned her weapon slightly. Mr. Vale, don't. Vale smiled. Detective, I am an attorney in a records room holding company files. Let us not make theater. He moved anyway. Officer Grant came around behind them from the hall, blocking the side exit with his weapon raised. Stop right there. Valley stopped. The mask finally slipped. Not much, but enough. Irritation crossed his face. Brandon looked from Vale to the police to Edward. You said you had it handled. Vale did not look at him. I had it handled until you used amateurs. Amateurs? Brandon said. You told me to hire Mason. I told you to create pressure. I assumed even you could do that without involving Victor Kane's daughter. Annie stepped closer. Say that again. Vale glanced at her. You are an unfortunate complication. No, Annie said. I'm the witness you didn't plan for, Hensley said. Mr. Vale. Hands behind your back. Vale gave a small laugh. On what grounds? Conspiracy, obstruction, attempted coercion, and we'll let financial crimes enjoy the rest. You have no idea how high this goes. Hensley moved in. People always say that when they're standing in a hallway with nowhere to go. Grant took Vale's arm and cuffed him. Vale did not resist, but his eyes stayed on Edward. This will damage you more than me, Vale said. Edward looked at him for a long moment. Maybe. But damage and truth are not the same thing. Annie heard the weight in that line and knew it had cost him. Brandon still held the folder. Hensley turned back. Mr. Whitaker, put it down. For a second, Annie thought he might run. His eyes moved to the side door, then to his father, then to the folder. He was no longer the arrogant voice on the phone. He looked young now, but not innocent. Edward stepped toward him slowly. Brandon, he said, this is the last door I can stand in before the law takes you through the next one. Put it down. Brandon's eyes filled, but his voice came bitter. You choose her over me? Edward flinched. No. I choose what is right over what you became. Brandon looked at Annie with pure resentment. You ruined everything. Annie shook her head. No, I just stayed late. The folder slipped from Brandon's hand and hit the floor. Hensley cuffed him herself. Edward did not look away while it happened. That was his punishment and his duty at the same time. Brandon cursed once, then went quiet. When the officers led him past, he paused beside his father. You'll regret this, he whispered. Edward answered, every day, but I will not undo it. They took Brandon down the hall. Vale followed, still calm, still dangerous in the way men with expensive lawyers remain dangerous even in handcuffs. Hensley stayed behind with Edward and Annie, while Officer Grant secured the files. The emergency lights hummed overhead. Edward bent slowly and picked up the folder Brandon had dropped. His bandaged hand made it awkward. Annie reached to help, and this time he let her. On the folder tab were 3 words: Whitaker, family, trust. Edward held it like something heavier than paper. Annie looked down the empty hallway where Brandon had disappeared. Midnight came early, she said. Edward's mouth tightened. No, he said. Midnight is when the world starts asking what happened here. Then he turned toward the broken office, the waiting police, and the truth neither of them could hide anymore. Edward Whitaker carried the trust file back to his office like a man carrying evidence of a death in the family. Annie walked beside him, close enough to catch him if his knees gave way, but far enough not to make him feel old. Detective Hensley followed with Officer Grant, who had the evidence bag containing Brandon's phone, the copied access logs, and Martin Vale's leather folder. Down the hall, 2 other officers were escorting Brandon and Vale toward the service elevator, away from the employees beginning to gather near the far end of the floor. People were coming out of offices now. Not many, but enough. A senior accountant who had stayed late stood near the copy room with one hand at her throat. A paralegal from contracts whispered into her phone until Hensley pointed at her and said, "Put it away, Mr." Lewis from the cleaning crew leaned on his mop handle, eyes moving from Edward's torn shirt to Annie's face. Paige from reception had returned from downstairs, hair loose from its clip, breathing hard as if she had run up 48 floors instead of taking the elevator. "What happened?" Paige asked. Edward stopped. He looked at the small crowd, then at Annie, then at the broken doorway of his office ahead. "Not here," he said. His voice was quiet, but the old command was still there. The whispering stopped. They entered the office again. The room looked worse now that the worst danger had passed. During the assault, everything had been movement. Now the damage had time to be ugly. The desk phone was still in pieces. The cracked glass wall caught the emergency lights in jagged lines. The tea stain had darkened. Papers lay scattered around the desk. Some stamped confidential, some marked by dirty boot prints. Edward stood in the middle of it and looked lost. Annie set a chair behind him. "Sit down before the medical lady comes back and yells at both of us." He gave her a tired look. "You keep threatening me with women who are right. It works." He sat. Detective Hensley placed the Whitaker family trust folder into a separate evidence sleeve but did not seal it yet. "Mr. Whitaker, I need to know what Mr. Vale intended to use in here." Edward rubbed his forehead with his good hand. "Voting proxies, succession language, emergency incapacity provisions. If someone could make the board believe I was compromised or mentally unstable, they might try to force temporary control. Could Brandon take that control? Not alone. But with Vale guiding him and a few frightened board members, they could create chaos by morning. And Annie's connection to Victor Kane would be part of the argument." Edward looked at Annie. He did not say yes. He did not have to. Annie leaned against the edge of the conference table, arms folded. "They wanted me to be the stain." Edward's face tightened. "That is not what you are. That's what people will call it. No, you don't get to decide how scared people talk, Mr. Whitaker." He flinched, not because she had been cruel, but because she had been right. Hensley looked between them. "We can control some of the narrative through facts. Police report, arrests, evidence, witness statements." Annie almost smiled. "Facts don't trend as fast as fear." Officer Grant gave her a quick look. He knew that was true too. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it. For a man used to boardrooms, he understood reputation. A company could survive a bad quarter. It could survive a lawsuit. But panic had its own appetite. By morning, if the wrong person leaked the wrong version, Whitaker Global would be tied to organized crime in every headline. Annie would become a question mark. Edward would look compromised. Brandon, if he found the right lawyer, might still claim he had been trying to protect the company from his father's hidden associations. The lie had bones. That made it dangerous. Hensley's phone rang. She stepped away, listened, then came back with the expression of someone about to make the night longer. Mason Briggs turned himself in. Annie looked up. "Already?" At the 22nd District Station, walked in with one of his men and asked for protective custody. Edward let out a breath that was almost disbelief. "Because of Victor." "Seems likely," Hensley said. "He's giving a statement. He says Brandon hired him through an intermediary arranged by Martin Vale. He also says he was told to frighten you, not kill you." "That's supposed to comfort me?" Edward asked. "No," Hensley said. "It's supposed to build the conspiracy." Annie looked toward the window. Somewhere below, the city moved on. People were heading home, heating leftovers, watching baseball, calling daughters, ignoring fathers, making mistakes that would not end with handcuffs. The ordinariness of it made the office feel even stranger. Hensley continued, "There's more. Mason says Vale had a press packet ready." Edward's eyes sharpened. "What kind of press packet?" "Draft statement from anonymous board sources. Allegations that you allowed an employee with ties to Victor Kane into executive operations. Questions about whether sensitive contracts were exposed. Suggestions that Brandon Whitaker raised concerns before tonight." Annie laughed once. "He attacks his father, then becomes the concerned son. That appears to be the strategy," Hensley said. Edward's good hand curled into a fist. "Vale wrote it." "Likely." Paige appeared in the doorway, hesitating. "Mr. Whitaker?" Everyone turned. She looked pale but determined. "I'm sorry. Security told us to stay back. But the board is already calling. Mr. Langford, Miss Chow, and Bishop are on a group line. They say they need to speak with you immediately." Edward closed his eyes. Annie could see the exhaustion hit him. Mason had struck his hand. Brandon had struck his heart. Vale had struck his name. Now the board would strike his time. Hensley said, "You don't have to take that call right now." Edward opened his eyes. "If I don't, they'll fill the silence themselves." Annie knew what that meant. Men and women in power hated empty spaces. They poured fear into them and called it judgment. Edward looked at Paige, put them on the conference screen. Audio only. Paige nodded and disappeared. Annie moved toward the door. "I'll step out." "No," Edward said. She stopped. He looked at her with a steadiness that made the room quieter. "They're going to talk about you. You should hear what they say when they know you're listening." Annie did not know whether that was kindness or punishment. Maybe both. She stayed. The conference screen lit up with 3 names. Thomas Langford, Evelyn Chow, Peter Bishop. Langford spoke first, sharp and breathless. "Edward, thank God. What in heaven's name is happening up there?" Edward sat straight despite his bandaged hand. "There was an armed break-in. Police are here. Brandon and Martin Vale are in custody." A stunned silence followed. Evelyn Chow's voice came next, controlled but tense. "Martin Vale?" "Yes," Bishop muttered. "Good Lord." Langford recovered first. "We're hearing rumors about Victor Kane. Tell me those are false." Edward looked at Annie. "His daughter works here as an intern." Langford cursed under his breath. Evelyn said, "Edward, did you know?" "No." "Did she have access to sensitive materials?" Annie almost answered, but Edward lifted his good hand slightly. "She had access appropriate to her internship," he said, "and tonight she prevented armed men from forcing my signature onto fraudulent transfer documents." Langford snapped, "That may be true, but the optics are catastrophic." Edward's face hardened. "Thomas, my son hired criminals to assault me, and you're worried about optics." "I'm worried about the company. So am I. That's why I refused to sign." Bishop spoke quietly. He was older, with a southern drawl and a habit of sounding like he was chewing each word before releasing it. "Who is the young woman?" Edward looked at Annie again. This time he did not speak for her. Annie stepped closer to the table. "My name is Annie Carter." Langford's voice sharpened. "Carter? My mother's name. And Kane?" "My father's," Evelyn asked. "Why were you working here?" Annie could have said she wanted experience. She could have said college applications, business exposure, career development. All of that would have been acceptable. All of that would have been incomplete. "I wanted to know what people saw when they weren't afraid of my last name," Annie said. No one on the call answered immediately. Then Langford said, "That's touching, but it doesn't solve our exposure." Edward's eyes cooled. "Be careful, Thomas. With respect, Edward, this is not about anyone's feelings. If this leaks, regulators, investors, and federal agencies will ask why Victor Kane's daughter was inside executive operations." Detective Hensley stepped closer to the screen. "They may also ask why a board member is discussing a witness like she's a liability, while police are still processing an active crime scene." Langford went silent. Evelyn said, "Who is speaking?" "Detective Laura Hensley, Chicago Police." Bishop cleared his throat. "Detective, is Miss Carter considered a suspect?" "No. She is a witness, and based on current evidence, a victim of threats during the incident." Annie had not expected the word victim. She did not like it. But she understood why Hensley used it. It placed her on the right side of the line before fear could move her. Evelyn exhaled. "Then we proceed with facts." Langford started. "Evelyn, no," she said. "We will not repeat Vale's strategy for him. If the girl saved Edward, we do not feed her to the press because her father frightens us." Annie looked down at the table. "There were people who surprised you in both directions." Edward's voice softened a little. "Thank you, Evelyn. Don't thank me yet. We need counsel, communications, and a board statement before midnight." "No anonymous leaks," Edward said. "Agreed," Bishop said. "We tell the truth or say nothing until we can." Langford was quiet too long, then said, "Fine." Edward leaned back, looking drained. "I'll join a formal call after the police finish." Evelyn said, "Edward, go to a hospital." "I will. Tonight." Annie muttered, "Thank you." Edward shot her a look. Evelyn heard it. "Was that Miss Carter?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Edward said. "She's been saying the same thing." "Smart girl." Annie allowed herself one small breath of relief. The call ended minutes later with instructions for legal preservation, internal silence, and a written statement to be drafted with police coordination. When the screen went black, Edward sat very still. Hensley sealed the trust file evidence bag. That went better than it could have. Edward looked at Annie. "Did it?" "Yes." she said. Only one of them sounded ready to throw me out a window. That would be Thomas. He sounds like he owns cufflinks with initials. Despite everything, Edward laughed once. It hurt his hand, but he laughed. Then Paige returned to the doorway, holding a tablet. Mr. Whitaker, there's something else. Edward's laugh faded. Paige stepped in and looked at Annie first. Someone sent an email draft to 3 media contacts. It didn't go out. It's stuck in Vale's scheduled outbox. Hensley moved toward her. Can you show me? Paige handed over the tablet. Annie read the subject line upside down before Hensley turned the screen. Whitaker CEO linked to Kane family operative. There it was, the lie with its suit on. Edward saw it too. His face went still. Annie folded her arms tighter, but her voice stayed calm. So that's what secrets cost, she said. Edward looked at her. No. That's what lies cost when they almost win. Outside, the clock moved toward midnight. Inside, for the first time, they had found the weapon meant to destroy them without making a sound. Detective Hensley took the tablet from Paige and read the scheduled email twice. No one interrupted her. The subject line alone was enough to damage Edward before sunrise. The body was worse. It was written with the clean poison of a man who understood boardrooms, newsrooms, and fear. It did not accuse Edward directly. It asked questions. That was how cowards dressed lies for public consumption. Why was the daughter of alleged crime figure Victor Kane placed inside executive operations at Whitaker Global Holdings? What sensitive files may have been exposed? Did CEO Edward Whitaker conceal the connection from the board? Did Brandon Whitaker attempt to raise concerns before being silenced? Annie read the lines over Hensley's shoulder and felt each one like a hand, trying to push her back into the shape the world preferred. Not Annie Carter. Not witness. Not intern. Not the girl who stayed late and stopped 4 armed men. Kane family operative. Edward's face had gone still, in the way a man's face goes still when anger is too large to show all at once. Who received it? Hensley asked. Paige swallowed. It was scheduled to go to 3 media contacts at 11:58 p.m. 2 business reporters and 1 local political columnist. It's still in Vale's draft queue because the system locked his account after security flagged him. Who found it? I did. After the board call, Miss Chow told me to suspend Vale's access. I saw an outgoing scheduled message waiting in the admin panel. Hensley looked at her. Do not delete it. Do not forward it. Do not open anything else, unless I tell you. Paige nodded quickly. Understood. Edward turned toward the dark windows. Chicago looked calm from up there, which felt almost indecent. People trusted skylines because they could not see what happened behind the lit rectangles. Vale knew exactly what to do, Edward said. Mason was noise. Brandon was anger. This was the real weapon. Annie's voice stayed quiet. He didn't need people to believe all of it. Just enough of it. That's how these things work, Hensley said. A question can stain faster than an accusation. Edward looked at Annie. I'm sorry. She turned. You didn't write it. No, but my house gave it somewhere to live. The words landed heavy. Not self-pity. Responsibility. Annie was learning that Edward had a way of blaming himself honestly, without using it to escape the next duty. Hensley handed the tablet back to Paige but kept her eyes on Edward. Mr. Whitaker, I need your legal and communications people looped in. This email is evidence, but the company also needs to preserve systems, identify who had access, and prevent any backup send. Edward nodded. Paige, call Evelyn Chow. Tell her we found Vale's scheduled email. Tell her to wake up outside counsel, not anyone Vale recommended. Paige already had her phone out. Yes, sir. And Paige? She stopped at the doorway. Thank you. Her face changed a little. People did not always expect gratitude in crisis. Of course. Mr. Whitaker. When she left, Edward looked at Hensley. If that message leaks anyway, then facts need to be ready before it spreads. Annie folded her arms. Facts don't stop people from wanting a villain. No, Hensley said, but they help honest people know where to stand. Annie looked at her. She wanted to believe that. Some nights she did. Other nights, she had seen honest people stay quiet, because standing had rent attached. Edward seemed to hear the unspoken thought. My mother used to say truth needs witnesses because truth by itself has no legs, he said. Annie looked at him. Your mother had a line for everything. She worked night shifts for 30 years. She had time to think. The small memory softened his face for one breath. Then Brandon returned to it. His son was now somewhere inside the machinery of arrest, statements, and consequences. Annie could see Edward trying not to imagine him in handcuffs. Hensley's phone buzzed. She answered, listened, and put it on speaker after a moment. A male voice came through. "Detective, this is Sergeant Mills at 22nd. Mason Briggs is still talking." Hensley set the phone on the desk. "Go ahead. He says Vale paid him through a construction consulting account tied to Northline Development. Brandon made contact, but Vale set terms. Briggs claims the job was to force a signature, photograph the signed originals, then leave the papers in Whitaker's office so it looked like an internal family matter." Edward's jaw tightened. "Northline, we rejected their bid last year." Hensley asked, "Anything else?" "Yes." Briggs says Vale told him cameras would be down from 6:20 to 6:45. But the system didn't fully go dark, which is why we have corridor footage. Briggs also says Vale warned him not to hurt the intern unless necessary because unknown staff create bad optics. Annie gave a humorless laugh. "That's kind of him." Edward did not smile. Sergeant Mills continued. "Briggs is asking whether Victor Kane knows he surrendered." Annie closed her eyes for half a second. Hensley looked at her before answering. "Tell Briggs cooperation is the only thing helping him right now. Mr. Kane is not part of our negotiation." "Copy that." The call ended. Edward looked at Annie. "Will your father let the police handle Mason?" Annie exhaled slowly. "If I ask him to. And if you don't?" She did not answer. That silence was honest enough. Edward leaned back, his bandaged hand resting on the arm of the chair. "I won't pretend to understand your life. Most people pretend they do. I won't." Annie met his eyes. He continued. "But if this is going to be done cleanly, it has to stay in the law. Not because the law is always fair. It isn't, but because the alternative leaves too many shadows for men like Vale to hide in." Annie heard the risk in that. Edward was asking her to restrain a world that had just saved him. He was also right. "My father won't like it," she said. "I imagine your father dislikes many things. That's one way to put it. Will he listen to you?" Annie thought of Victor's voice on the phone. "Miss Annie. Are you hurt? Do you need me there?" Men feared him because of what he could do. Annie had feared, in a different way, what his love could become when sharpened. "Yes," she said. "He'll listen. Then ask him." She pulled out the gold phone. Hensley watched but said nothing. Edward did too. Annie pressed the button, and the call connected almost immediately. Victor's voice filled the office. "Annie, I'm okay. You were supposed to call me back in 10 minutes. It hasn't been 10 calm minutes." A pause. "Where is Briggs?" "Police custody. I know where he is. I asked where he will be when the police finish pretending walls protect him." Detective Hensley's face hardened, but Annie lifted one hand slightly, asking her not to speak. "Dad," Annie said. "Leave him alone." Victor went silent. Annie continued. "Mason is talking. He gave up Brandon and Vale. If anything happens to him, the whole case gets dirtier. Dirtier than men putting hands on you? They didn't. They tried. And I handled it." Edward looked down, almost smiling despite himself. Victor's voice dropped. "That is not the point. It is tonight. I need this done in court. Not in an alley. Not through a message. Not with everybody whispering that Victor Kane cleaned up his daughter's problem. This is not your problem." "Yes, it is," Annie said. "Because they're going to use me to hurt Mr. Whitaker. They already tried." Victor's tone changed. "Explain." Annie told him about Vale's email, the headline, the attempt to frame her as an operative and Edward as compromised. She kept it brief, factual, but she could feel Victor's anger building through the silence. When she finished, he said, "Give me Vale. He's in custody. Give me his name again." "No. Annie, no. You taught me power isn't for tantrums." Edward looked up at that. Victor breathed once through his nose. "I taught you that when you were 8 and angry at a boy for taking your lunch. And it still applies." Hensley's eyebrow lifted slightly. Victor said, "You are asking me to do nothing. I'm asking you to let the law do something. The law moves slowly, so do consequences when they matter." Another silence. Then Victor said, "Put Whitaker on." Annie looked at Edward. Edward reached for the phone. Annie put it on speaker instead. "This is Edward Whitaker. My daughter says you treated her well." Edward looked at Annie before answering. "Not well enough, apparently. I never asked what she had to carry. That was not your job." "No, but seeing people properly is everyone's job." Victor did not respond at once. Edward continued. "Your daughter saved my life tonight. She also stopped me from making the worst mistake a frightened father could make. I owe her honesty, and I intend to give her that." Victor's voice was quieter when he spoke. "If your company uses her as a shield, I will consider that an insult." "So will I," Edward said. Annie felt something loosen in her chest. Victor said, "And if the police fail?" Detective Hensley stepped forward. "This is Detective Laura Hensley. We have Brandon Whitaker and Martin Vale in custody. Mason Briggs cooperating, digital evidence preserved, and an attempted media leak intercepted. No one benefits from outside interference." Victor's tone chilled. "Detective, men like Vale are built to survive your paperwork." "Maybe," Hensley said, "but paperwork put Al Capone away when bullets didn't." The room went very still. Annie almost laughed from sheer nerves. Victor did not laugh, but after a moment he said, "You have until morning to prove your paperwork has teeth." Hensley replied, "We'll take the time we need and do it right." "I was not asking." "No," Hensley said. "You were threatening." "I'm documenting." Edward closed his eyes as if he could not believe this was happening in his office. Annie said quickly, "Dad." Victor's voice softened for her. "I will not touch Briggs. I will not touch Vale. I will not touch Brandon Whitaker." Edward's shoulders dropped a fraction. "For now," Victor added. "Dad, for now is what I can give." Annie accepted it because she knew better than to push a miracle until it broke. "Thank you. Come home when this is done." "I will." "And Annie?" "Yes? You are still my daughter, even when you are trying to be ordinary." The words reached her in a place she had not guarded. She ended the call before her voice could change. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Detective Hensley said, "Your father is a difficult man." Annie slipped the gold phone away. "That's his polite setting." Edward let out a short laugh, then winced and held his bandaged hand. Hensley turned back to the tablet. "We need a statement before midnight. Not a press release full of fog. A factual hold statement. Armed intrusion, suspects in custody, CEO cooperating with police, witness protected, no evidence of company data exposure. Keep it short." Edward nodded. "Evelyn can draft it." "No," Annie said. They all looked at her. She swallowed. "Let me help." Edward studied her. "You don't have to. I know. You shouldn't have to defend yourself from a lie you didn't create." "I'm not defending myself," Annie said. "I'm making sure they don't turn me into someone else." Edward held her gaze, then nodded. Paige returned with a laptop under one arm. "Miss Chow is on the line. Outside counsel is joining. Also, the scheduled email is frozen and archived." "Good," Edward said. "Set up here." Paige cleared a space on the conference table, pushing aside untouched water bottles and a stack of binders. Annie sat down beside Edward. Not behind him, not at the edge of the room, but beside him. Hensley stood near the door, listening. Officer Grant remained in the hall. On the laptop screen, Evelyn Chow appeared in a robe over a blouse, hair pulled back, face alert. "Edward, Annie, I've read Paige's summary. We need to move carefully." Edward said, "We need to move honestly." Evelyn looked at Annie. "Can you handle seeing what they may say about you?" Annie thought of the email subject line. "Kane family operative." She thought of the security guard checking her badge twice. Craig handing her lunch orders. Mason calling her brat. Brandon saying she should have gone home. "Yes," she said. "I've been reading versions of it my whole life." Evelyn's face changed. Not pity, not quite. Recognition. Then let's write something they can't easily twist. The statement took 23 minutes. It said there had been an armed unlawful entry into the executive offices of Whitaker Global Holdings. It said Edward Whitaker was injured but safe. It said multiple individuals were in police custody. It said a young employee had acted courageously and was cooperating as a witness. It said any attempt to spread claims about criminal infiltration was false, malicious, and part of an apparent effort to distract from the assault and attempted coercion. Annie asked to remove young employee. Everyone looked at her. "What do you want instead?" Evelyn asked. "My name." Edward nodded before anyone else could speak. "Use her name." So they did. At 11:41 p.m., Whitaker Global released the statement. 17 minutes before Vale's lie was supposed to leave his outbox, the truth stepped out first. At 11:41 p.m., Annie Carter's name went out with the truth. Not as a rumor, not as a stain, not as a whisper attached to her father. Her name appeared in the official statement from Whitaker Global Holdings because she had asked for it, and Edward had backed her before anyone else could make the room smaller around her. For almost a full minute after Paige sent the statement, no one said anything. The office was still a crime scene. The desk phone remained smashed. The tea stain still darkened the carpet. The broken cup had been photographed but not moved. Edward's hand throbbed beneath the bandage. Detective Hensley stood near the doorway, reading the released statement on her phone. Evelyn Chow stayed on the laptop screen, silent, waiting for the first wave of reaction. Then Paige's tablet began to buzz. She looked down. "It's already being picked up." Edward closed his eyes, but only for a second. "By who?" Chicago Business Journal reposted the company statement. Channel 7 has a breaking news banner. 2 reporters are asking for confirmation that Brandon is in custody. "Do not confirm names beyond what police approve," Hensley said. Paige nodded. "Understood." Annie sat at the conference table with her hands folded in front of her. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, steady but hard. Seeing her name in the statement had not felt like victory. It had felt like stepping onto a stage before knowing whether the crowd came to listen or throw stones. Edward looked at her. "You can still decide not to speak to anyone tonight. I know. You don't owe the public your pain." "No," Annie said, "but I owe myself the truth before somebody else dresses it up." Evelyn Chow leaned closer to her camera. "Annie, there will be questions. Some fair, some ugly. Reporters may dig into your family, your school, your mother, your address if they can find it. We can shield some of it, not all." Annie nodded. "They've been digging around my father for years. I grew up learning what curtains were for." Edward's face tightened at that, not because she sounded frightened, but because she sounded practiced. Hensley put her phone away. "For tonight, no interviews. You give your formal statement to police, then you go somewhere safe." "My aunt's place," Annie said. Edward shook his head. "If reporters find it, they won't." Hensley gave her a look. Annie sighed. "Fine. They might. But I'm not hiding in your building." "No," Edward said. "You're not. You're going somewhere protected." Annie looked at him. "Mr. Whitaker, I have lived protected. It has a cost. So does being exposed. That's my choice." Edward opened his mouth, then stopped. She saw him fighting the instinct to overrule her for her own good. She appreciated that he did not. Evelyn spoke gently. "Protection does not have to mean a cage." Annie almost answered, but Paige's tablet buzzed again. Paige read the screen, and her expression changed. "What?" Edward asked. "It's Brandon's attorney." Edward's eyes hardened. "Already?" "Statement from their office. It says Brandon Whitaker denies orchestrating violence and claims he was attempting to prevent his father from exposing the company to undisclosed criminal associations." The room went cold. Annie did not move. Edward's voice was low. "Read the rest." Paige swallowed. "It says Brandon is cooperating with authorities and has long been concerned about irregular influences around executive operations." Hensley muttered something under her breath. Edward looked at Annie. Vale's strategy survived his arrest. "Of course it did," Evelyn said from the screen. "Lawyers have printers too." Annie stood. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Edward watched her. "Annie?" She walked to the cracked glass wall and looked out at the city. Chicago did not care what had been said about her. It glittered anyway. Every window holding another life. Another dinner plate in the sink. Another argument in a kitchen. Another old man falling asleep with the television on. She had wanted to be part of that ordinary world. Tonight, ordinary had turned its lights off and left her standing under a headline. "He's still using me," she said. Edward did not answer too quickly. "Yes, I hate that. I do too." "No, you hate that it hurts me. I hate that it works." That landed, and nobody tried to soften it. Detective Hensley stepped closer. It only works if the evidence can't catch up. Evidence moves slow, Annie said. So do judges, but they move. Annie turned from the window. Detective, can I give my statement now? Hensley nodded. Yes. They moved into the smaller side conference room because the main office still needed processing. Edward tried to follow, but Annie stopped him with a look. You need your hand checked. I can wait. You've been saying that for an hour. I'm good at waiting. You're bad at listening. Evelyn's voice came from the laptop on the table behind them. Edward, go to the hospital. Edward looked betrayed. Not you two, especially me. Hensley closed her notebook with a snap. Mr. Whitaker, an officer can take your initial statement at the hospital. Miss Carter is safe here with me. Edward looked at Annie. Are you sure? There it was again. Not suspicion, not control. Concern. Annie's anger softened despite herself. I'm sure. He nodded, but he did not move yet. Before I go, I need to say something. Annie waited. Edward looked tired enough to collapse, but his voice held. When I hired you, I didn't know who your father was. When you saved me, I still didn't know. And when people try to reduce you to his name, I will say that every time they need to hear it. Annie had prepared herself for questions, distance, maybe fear. She had not prepared for a man with a broken hand and a broken heart standing in a wrecked office to defend the small piece of normal she had tried to build. She looked down before her eyes could betray her. Thank you, she said. Edward seemed to understand that was all she could manage. He turned to leave with the medical attendant and one officer, then paused at the doorway. Annie, she looked up. You were right. I shouldn't sign. A faint smile crossed her face. That was not exactly my most controversial opinion tonight. No, he said, but it may have saved more than my life. After he left, the office felt larger and emptier. Hensley guided Annie into the side conference room. The room had 6 chairs, a wall screen, a whiteboard covered with old strategy notes, and a tray of untouched bottled water. Annie chose the chair facing the door. Hensley noticed and sat across from her. Comfortable? No. Fair enough. Hensley turned on a recorder and stated the time, location, and names. Her voice was professional but not cold. Annie, I'm going to ask you to walk me through everything again. Take your time. Annie took a breath and began. This time, without Edward in the room, the story felt different. She described Mason's grip on Edward's collar, the bar striking his hand, the way Brandon's name came out of Mason's mouth like a weapon. She explained how she used force only when the men approached her or threatened Edward. She described the gold phone and the call to Victor Kane. Hensley asked, Did your father instruct them to leave? Yes. Did he threaten them? Annie paused. He didn't need to be specific. That's not quite an answer. It's the honest one. Hensley accepted that with a small nod. Did you believe Mason and his men left because they feared your father would harm them? Yes. Did you ask your father to harm them? No. Did you later ask him not to? Yes. Hensley looked up. Why? Because if this turns into my father's revenge, Brandon gets to hide behind the mess. Vale gets to say everything he wrote was true, and Mr. Whitaker loses the cleanest thing he still has. Which is his choice not to sign. Hensley's pen stopped. That matters to you. It should matter to everyone. The detective watched her for a moment. You're 18. I know. You sound older. Annie looked at the recorder. That isn't always a compliment. No, Hensley said. It isn't. For the first time all night, Annie felt the detective see not just the threat around her, but the cost inside it. The statement took 40 minutes. When it ended, Annie was exhausted in a way fighting had not made her. Hensley turned off the recorder and slid a bottle of water across the table. You did well. Annie gave a tired laugh. People keep saying that tonight. Maybe believe them. Annie opened the water but did not drink. Do you? Do I what? Believe me. Hensley did not answer like a comforter. She answered like a detective. Yes. And more importantly, the evidence is starting to. Annie took a drink. Her regular phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A text from her aunt. Baby, there are news vans outside my building. Tell me you are alive. Annie closed her eyes. Hensley saw the message. You're not going there tonight. No, Annie said quietly. Another message came in. This one was from an unknown number. You should have stayed invisible. Annie stared at it. Then she turned the phone so Hensley could see. The detective's face hardened. Looks like midnight isn't done with us, Hensley said. Annie stared at the message until the words stopped, looking like words. You should have stayed invisible. There was no name, no punctuation, no attempt to disguise the cruelty as anything else. Just a sentence sent to an 18-year-old girl sitting in a side conference room after she had fought off armed men, watched a billionaire's son get arrested, and placed her own name into a public statement before another man could turn it into a weapon. Detective Hensley took the phone without touching the screen more than necessary. Do you recognize the number? No. Have you received messages like this before? Annie gave a short breath. Not from strangers. Not usually. Hensley looked up. From people around your father? People around my father know better than to text threats. That answer made Hensley pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was practical. She photographed the screen with her department phone, then handed Annie's phone back. Don't respond. I wasn't going to. Good. Forward it to the number I'm giving you, then put your phone on silent. We'll trace what we can, but burner phones are cheap. Annie followed the instruction. Her fingers moved smoothly, though her stomach had tightened. She did not want to admit the message had reached her, not because it scared her in the simple way Mason's iron bar had. This was different. Mason had been in front of her. His threat had a body, a face, a distance she could measure. This message could be anywhere. Hensley watched her. You're thinking it came from Brandon. It sounds like him. Could be someone trying to sound like him. Val? He's in custody. Custody doesn't stop a plan already moving. Hensley nodded once. No, it doesn't. The door opened, and Paige leaned in carefully, as if every room on the floor might now contain bad news. Detective, sorry. Miss Chow is asking for you and Annie. There's another issue. Annie stood before Hensley could answer. The detective gave her a look. You're not required to walk toward every fire. No, Annie said, but I'm usually already in the building. Hensley did not smile, but her eyes softened. Stay beside me. They returned to Edward's office. He was not there now. The medical team had finally taken him downstairs with an officer, and the room felt changed without him. Less anchored. The broken objects seemed louder. The laptop still sat on the conference table. Evelyn Chow on the screen, now joined by two outside counsel attorneys whose names Annie did not catch. Everyone looked tired and wired at the same time. Evelyn saw Annie. Are you all right? No. Evelyn blinked once, then nodded. Fair answer. Hensley stepped beside Annie. What happened? Paige turned the tablet toward them. The frozen email wasn't the only one. Vale had a second scheduled release through an encrypted marketing platform. Not our company servers. Outside counsel found the reference in his calendar notes. We can't access it yet. Annie felt the air leave the room. What time? Hensley asked. Midnight, Evelyn said. 19 minutes from now. What does it say? We don't know. The calendar entry only says contingency narrative package. Hensley's mouth tightened. Of course it does. One of the lawyers on the screen said, We're contacting the platform's emergency legal response line, but without a court order. Hensley cut in. Send me the platform name and all identifiers. Now, Paige typed quickly. Annie looked at the clock on the wall. 11:41 had felt like a victory. Now 11:41 felt like Vale had allowed them one door so they would miss another. Evelyn folded her hands under her chin. Annie, this may contain more about you. I figured. It may include your father's name, photographs, employment forms, anything Vale could access or obtain. He couldn't access much about me through the company, Annie said. I used Carter. My emergency contact is my aunt. Evelyn's face darkened. Then he got it elsewhere. Hensley looked at Annie. Who knew you were Victor Kane's daughter before tonight? My aunt, my father, his people, a few people from my old school maybe, but not officially. Old school? Private academy on the North Shore. I left after sophomore year. Why? Annie's jaw tightened. Because being protected there looked too much like being watched. Hensley did not push further, but Annie could see her filing it away. The conference room phone rang. Paige answered, listened, then put it on speaker. A man's voice came through, clipped and hurried. This is Daniel Reyes with outside counsel. We reached the platform. They won't suspend the scheduled blast without law enforcement certification of an active criminal matter or direct account authorization. Hensley stepped forward. This is Detective Laura Hensley, Chicago Police. You'll have certification in 5 minutes. Send me the contact. They're asking whether there is imminent physical danger. Hensley looked at Annie's phone in her hand. A witness just received a threat related to the same matter. I'll relay that. The line clicked to hold music so cheerful it felt insulting. Annie looked toward the broken desk phone. Vale built layers, Evelyn said. He's done crisis work for hostile takeovers. He knows how to seed doubt. Why help Brandon? Annie asked. Money? Edward's voice came from the doorway before anyone could answer. Control. Everyone turned. Edward stood there with his right hand newly braced, his shirt still torn under a borrowed dark overcoat someone had thrown around his shoulders. An officer stood behind him looking apologetic, as if he had tried and failed to keep Edward downstairs. Annie crossed the room. You're supposed to be at the hospital. I went. For 9 minutes? They x-rayed my hand. And? Bad bruise, no break. She narrowed her eyes. That sounds like a man quoting only the part he liked. The officer behind him said, Doctor recommended observation because of blood pressure. Edward sighed. Thank you, officer. Annie looked at him. Sit down. This time he did. No argument. That frightened her more than the argument would have. Evelyn spoke from the screen. Edward, you should not be back up there. Vale has another release scheduled, he said. I'm not waiting in an ER while he burns down my company. He may be trying to burn Annie first, Hensley said. Edward's face shifted. He looked at Annie. What happened? She showed him the message. You should have stayed invisible. Edward read it, and something in him hardened beyond fatigue. No, he said. It was quiet. But everyone heard it. No, he repeated. She will not be punished for being seen. Annie looked away because the sentence hit too close. Edward turned to Evelyn. What did Vale want? Evelyn answered. Likely an emergency board action. Remove you temporarily. Present Brandon as damaged but cooperative. Then use Annie's identity to argue compromised executive judgment. Vale didn't just want Brandon in charge, Edward said. He wanted me out so he could control Brandon. Brandon would hold the title. Vale would hold the leash. Hensley said, and the debt? Northline Development, Edward said. Vale pushed them twice. I rejected them twice. They wanted access to our medical transport contracts, rural hospital routes, veteran supply chains, state procurement corridors, boring work to people like Brandon, worth millions to people who know how to bleed public systems quietly. Annie understood then. This was not just a rich son's tantrum. Brandon had opened the door, but men like Vale had been waiting outside with plans for everything Edward had protected. Evelyn said, Edward, that needs to go to federal authorities. It will, Hensley said. After we stopped the midnight blast, Daniel Reyes came back on the phone. Detective, Platform Legal is on. They'll accept a written emergency request from CPD and account freeze from corporate counsel, if we indemnify pending warrant. Do it, Hensley said. One lawyer objected. There are liability implications. Edward cut in. I'll sign whatever protects Annie and preserves evidence. Annie turned to him. Don't sign anything without reading it. That's how this whole night started. For one impossible second, the room almost laughed. Edward looked at her, and the edge of a smile appeared. Point taken. Paige brought the laptop closer. Documents moved fast after that. Hensley dictated the emergency basis. Evelyn approved the freeze request. Reyes argued with platform counsel. Edward authorized corporate action with his left hand, awkwardly, while Annie watched every page like a hawk. At 11:57, the platform froze Vale's account. At 11:58, the outgoing package was captured but not released. At 11:59, Paige opened the preserved preview under Hensley's direction. The first image loaded slowly. It was Annie, not from Whitaker Global, not from tonight. From years earlier, outside a private school gate, age 15, walking beside a black SUV with 2 men behind her. The headline above it read, Victor Kane's daughter planted inside Whitaker Global months before executive attack. Annie felt the room tilt, but only for a second. Then she read the word months and almost laughed. "I've worked here 1 month," she said. Evelyn's voice was sharp. "The lie doesn't care." The next page contained cropped photos, anonymous quotes, a timeline full of false connections, and a claim that Edward had secretly hired Annie to negotiate with her father's network. It was absurd. It was also written well enough to hurt. Edward looked sick. "They made you the bridge." "No," Annie said, her voice cold. "They made me the bait." Hensley was already photographing the screen. "This is evidence of a coordinated disinformation effort tied to coercion." Edward looked at Annie. "I am so sorry." She shook her head. "Don't waste sorry. Use it." "For what?" She looked at the frozen lie on the screen, then at the official statement already out in the world. "Tomorrow," Annie said, "you tell them exactly who Brandon sent, what Vale tried to do, and why they needed a black girl with a dangerous last name to take the blame." Evelyn looked at her carefully. "That will put you in front of cameras." Annie's hands were steady now. "I spent too long trying to be invisible," she said. "Look where that got us." The frozen package stayed on the screen like a body that had not yet been covered. Annie looked at the photograph of her 15-year-old self outside the school gate. She remembered that morning. It had been cold. Her math binder had split at the corner, and she had been worried about a quiz on quadratic functions. The two men behind her were not Kane associates, in the way Vale's caption suggested. One was her father's driver. The other had once taught her how to change a tire in a gas station parking lot because he said no girl should wait helplessly beside a road. A lie did not need to know the people it used. It only needed their outlines. Edward read the headline again, slower this time, as if each word had to be weighed before he allowed himself to hate it. "Planted," he said. Annie kept her arms folded. "That's the word that does the damage." Evelyn Chow's face on the laptop screen was tight with controlled anger. "It suggests intention, coordination, espionage. It suggests I'm not a person," Annie said. "Just a delivery method for my father's name." Nobody rushed to answer. That was good. Annie had grown tired of people filling silence with comfort they had not earned. Detective Hensley photographed every page of the frozen media package, then directed Page to preserve the metadata. Outside, counsel stayed on the line, speaking in clipped phrases about subpoenas, warrants, server logs, and chain of custody. The words mattered, but they sounded far away. Annie's attention kept returning to the school photo, to the girl in it who had not yet learned how many rooms would decide who she was before she spoke. Edward turned from the screen. "Tomorrow morning, we hold a press briefing." Evelyn answered immediately. "Edward, that is risky. Silence is riskier. You're injured. Brandon has counsel. Vale will deny everything. Reporters will ask about Victor Kane before they ask about the assault. Then I will answer them." Annie looked at him. "You don't have to put yourself in front of cameras for me." Edward's face softened, but his voice did not. "This isn't charity, Annie. Vale tried to use you to steal control of my company and bury my son's crime under racial fear and class panic. If I let that stand, I deserve to lose everything." The room held still around that sentence. Evelyn studied him through the screen. "Then we do it clean. No speeches that sound like revenge. No emotional claims we can't support. We present the facts. Name what we can name. Protect the investigation. And make it clear. Miss Carter is a witness and employee who acted with courage." "My full name," Annie said. Evelyn nodded. "Annie Carter." Edward glanced at her. "Not Kane?" Annie shook her head. "My father gave me blood. My mother gave me the name I used when I wanted to become myself." Edward accepted that without argument. Detective Hensley lowered her phone. "I can't let you disclose details that compromise active charges, but I can confirm the basics tomorrow if the department approves. Unlawful entry, assault, attempted coercion, suspects in custody, digital evidence recovered." Edward looked at her. "And Brandon? His arrest will become public soon enough. I won't hide it, but I won't try him at a podium." "That's fair." Annie almost laughed. Fair had become such a strange word tonight. Nothing about this was fair. Edward's son had betrayed him. Vale had nearly turned Annie's race and family into a corporate weapon. Mason had walked out alive because he feared her father more than the law. Yet here they were, trying to build something honest from pieces left by dishonest men. Her regular phone buzzed again. Everyone looked at her. Annie checked the screen. This time it was her aunt. "Baby, your father called me. Then the news called me. I like your father better right now. Where are you sleeping tonight?" Despite herself, Annie smiled. Edward saw it. "Your aunt?" "Yes. What did she say?" "That she likes my father better than the news." Evelyn said, "Smart woman." Annie typed back, "I'm safe. I'll call soon. Don't open the door for reporters. Don't yell at them either." Her aunt replied almost instantly, "I make no promises about the yelling." Annie slipped the phone away. Edward leaned back in his chair, and the movement cost him. His face went pale. Annie noticed. So did Paige. "Hospital," Annie said. He gave her a look. "We are in the middle of planning a press briefing. You have a laptop. They have hospitals with chairs." Evelyn added, "Edward, go. We can draft while you're examined." Detective Hensley closed her notebook. "I also need you medically cleared before tomorrow if you plan to speak publicly." Edward looked around the room, saw no ally, and surrendered with a tired breath. "Fine. But I'm not being admitted unless a doctor can prove I'm dying." Paige muttered, "That sounds medically flexible." Annie liked Paige more every hour. An officer escorted Edward downstairs again. This time with Annie, Hensley, and Paige following. The executive floor looked different now. More people had gathered behind security lines. Some stared at Edward's bandaged hand. Some stared at Annie. A few looked away when she met their eyes. Mr. Lewis stood near the elevator with his mop bucket beside him. His face was lined with worry. "Miss Annie," he said, "you all right?" The question reached her differently from all the others. Maybe because he asked it like a grandfather at a bus stop. Not a detective. Not a CEO. Not a lawyer. Just a man who had cleaned enough floors to know when something bad had happened on one. "I'm all right, Mr. Lewis." He looked at Edward. "You too, boss?" Edward gave him a weary nod. "Working on it." Mr. Lewis's eyes dropped to Edward's hand. "Man gets old. He learns Bones ain't as proud as the rest of him." Edward almost smiled. "I'm learning a lot tonight." The elevator opened. Before Edward stepped in, he turned back to the small group of employees. They were frightened, curious, tired, and waiting for someone above them to say whether the ground beneath their jobs was cracking. "There will be more information tomorrow," Edward said. "For tonight, go home. Be safe. Do not speak to reporters. And if anyone asks, this company is still standing because people did the right thing when it was hard." His eyes moved to Annie. Everyone saw it. Annie felt the attention land on her shoulders, but this time she did not shrink from it. The elevator descended in silence. In the lobby, the world had already arrived. Red and blue lights flashed outside the glass entrance. News vans waited beyond the police line. Reporters stood under the building canopy with microphones, phones, and the hungry posture of people who could smell a story but not yet taste it. Security had moved planters to block the doors. A woman from Channel 7 pressed her face toward the glass, then pointed when she recognized Edward. "Back exit," Hensley said. Edward nodded. Annie looked through the glass at the cameras. "Tomorrow they'll be closer." "Yes," Edward said. "Some of them will ask whether I'm dangerous." Edward followed her gaze. "What will you say?" Annie thought about Victor's gold phone, Mason's pale face, the men on the floor, Vale's frozen lie. The school photograph turned into bait. "I'll say they should ask why dangerous men were so comfortable underestimating me." Edward looked at her for a long moment. "That's a good answer. It's the polite one." That made him laugh, and this time he did not hide the pain afterward. He leaned against the elevator wall for a breath until the back service doors opened. A police SUV took Edward to Northwestern Memorial. Annie rode in a separate car with Detective Hensley, because Hensley said it was procedure, and Annie suspected it was also protection. Paige stayed behind with security and Evelyn on the line, preserving records and locking systems. The city rolled past in late-night fragments, an ambulance turning on Ontario, a couple arguing outside a diner, a man walking a small dog in pajama pants, the river black beneath the bridges. Annie rested her head against the window. Hensley drove in silence for a few minutes, then said, "You meant what you said about tomorrow?" "Yes. You know they'll try to make you angry." "I know. Don't give them the picture they want." Annie turned from the window. You think I don't know that? Hensley kept her eyes on the road. I think you know it too well. That's different. Annie looked back out at the city. At the hospital, Edward was taken into an exam room. Annie waited in a side family area with Hensley near the door and an officer outside. The television mounted in the corner was muted, but the captions showed the first version of the story. Armed incident at Whitaker Global. CEO injured. Suspects detained. No mention of Victor yet. No mention of the frozen lie. Not publicly. Annie watched the words crawl across the screen and felt the strange mercy of time bought at the last minute. Her gold phone vibrated. She answered without putting it on speaker. Dad. Victor's voice was quieter than before. There are reporters outside your aunt's building. I know. My people are keeping distance. Good. I can remove them. No. I meant the reporters. I know what you meant. A small silence passed between them. Then Victor said, You intend to stand beside Whitaker tomorrow? Yes. You do not owe him that. No. I owe me that. He was quiet long enough that Annie could hear hospital footsteps, a cart rolling, someone coughing down the hall. You sound like your mother, he said. Annie closed her eyes. Is that supposed to make me stop? No, Victor said. It is why I know I cannot. When she ended the call, Edward was standing in the doorway with a doctor behind him, his hand braced, his face exhausted but alert. Doctor says I'm not dying, he said. The doctor, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and no patience for billionaires, said, Doctor says he needs rest, medication, and a follow-up, he edited. Annie stood. I believe the doctor. Edward looked at Hensley. Is the briefing set? Hensley checked her phone. 9 a.m. Police Headquarters. Limited statement. No questions beyond scope unless you choose otherwise. Edward looked at Annie. Your choice. Annie looked at the muted television, at the words moving across the bottom of the screen, at the first public outline of a night that had nearly swallowed her whole. Then she looked back at Edward. 9 a.m., she said. Edward nodded. Outside, Chicago moved toward morning. Inside, Annie Carter chose not to disappear. At 8:12 the next morning, Annie Carter stood in a restroom at Chicago Police Headquarters, staring at herself in a mirror that made everyone look tired. She had slept for 43 minutes in a chair at the hospital with her aunt's coat folded under her head. Her aunt, Denise Carter, had arrived just after dawn with a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches, 2 bottles of orange juice, and the kind of anger only family could carry without dropping it. I told you office work was dangerous, Denise had said, pulling Annie into a hug before Annie could answer. People think I'm joking when I say, spreadsheets are where the devil hides. Annie had held on longer than she meant to. Now Denise waited outside the restroom with Detective Hensley, while Annie adjusted the collar of the clean blouse Paige had brought from a nearby store. It was white, simple, and still creased from the bag. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes looked older than they had yesterday. She touched the temporary intern badge in her pocket. She had brought it without knowing why. Maybe because last night everyone had tried to decide what name mattered most. Kane. Carter. Intern. Witness. Problem. Operative. She needed to remember the smallest label was the one she had chosen for herself. The restroom door opened. Denise stepped in without asking. She was in her late 40s, sturdy, sharp-eyed, wearing a red cardigan over scrubs because she had come straight from her shift at a long-term care facility. She looked Annie over once. You look like you're about to testify before Congress. I'm trying to look calm. You look calm. That's what worries me. Annie smiled a little. Auntie. Denise came closer and fixed one crease near Annie's shoulder. Listen to me. You do not owe those cameras your whole soul. You answer what you choose. You breathe. And if some reporter gets slick, you look at Detective Hensley. Not at me. Because I promised Jesus and your father I would not get arrested today. Despite herself, Annie laughed. That laugh steadied her more than any speech could have. Denise cupped her face. Your mama would be proud. The words struck quietly. Annie looked down. Denise softened. Not because you fought. Because you stood where you believed you should stand. Annie swallowed. Dad said I sounded like her. You do. Especially when you're being impossible. They walked out together. Edward was waiting near the briefing room with Evelyn Chow, Detective Hensley, 2 police media officers, and a doctor's warning still hanging around him like an unwanted coat. His right hand was braced. A bruise had darkened along one knuckle. He wore a fresh navy suit, but the exhaustion showed through it. No expensive tailoring could hide the fact that his son had tried to break him less than 15 hours earlier. He stood when Annie approached. Denise immediately pointed at him. "Sit down before you fall down. I don't care how much money you have." Edward blinked, then sat. Annie looked away to hide a smile. Edward glanced at her. "I see where you get it. You have no idea," Annie said. Denise shook Edward's left hand. "Denise Carter. Annie's aunt. Edward Whitaker. I owe your niece my life." Denise's face did not soften as much as most people's would have. "Then pay her back by telling the truth clean." "I intend to." "Good. Rich people make things foggy when they get scared." Evelyn Chow coughed once into her hand. Detective Hensley looked at the floor. Edward nodded. "You're not wrong." That seemed to satisfy Denise. A police media officer reviewed the order. Detective Hensley would give confirmed facts. Edward would speak briefly. Annie could speak if she chose. They would not discuss sealed evidence, Victor Kane's activities, or specific charges beyond what had already been filed. They would not take extended questions, but there would be a few. Annie listened, but the murmur beyond the briefing room doors kept pulling at her. Reporters, cameras, the hungry shuffle of people waiting for a face to attach to a story. Edward leaned toward her. "You can still step back." Annie looked at him. "Can you?" "No." "Then neither can I." The doors opened. Camera lights hit first. Annie had expected them to feel hot. Instead, they felt cold. The briefing room was full but controlled. Reporters stood behind a marked line. Cameras pointed toward the podium. Phones were raised. A few heads turned when Annie entered, and she felt the recognition ripple through people who had already seen her name online. There she is, not said aloud, but present. Detective Hensley took the podium. Her statement was short and exact. Armed unlawful entry at Whitaker Global Holdings. Edward Whitaker injured. Attempted coercion involving fraudulent transfer documents. Multiple suspects in custody, including Brandon Whitaker and Martin Vale. Mason Briggs cooperating. Digital evidence recovered relating to an attempted misinformation release. Ongoing investigation with financial crimes units, and possible federal referral. Then Edward stepped forward. He did not grip the podium with his injured hand. Annie noticed. So did the cameras. "Last night," Edward said, "men entered my office and attempted to force me to sign away control through fear. They failed. They failed because the truth was stronger than the pressure they brought into that room, and because Annie Carter, an intern at my company, showed courage when she had every reason to run." Cameras clicked. Edward continued. "Some people have already tried to make this story about her family. I will be clear. I did not know Annie's father when she joined Whitaker Global. I knew Annie as a hard-working young employee who stayed late, did her job carefully, and treated people with respect. Last night, she protected me before anyone in that room knew anything else about her." Annie stared at the floor for 1 second, not from shame, to keep herself steady. Edward's voice changed, gaining weight. The attempt to use her identity as a distraction is not only false, it is cowardly. It relies on the assumption that a young black woman can be turned into suspicion more easily than a wealthy man can be held accountable. I reject that. This company rejects that. The room went very still. Annie looked up. Edward's jaw was tight, his face pale, but he did not retreat. "My son is in custody," he said. That sentence is painful to say. But love does not require silence in the face of wrongdoing. I will cooperate fully with law enforcement. So will Whitaker Global. He stepped back. The police media officer looked at Annie. She had not promised she would speak. She had only promised herself she would decide when the moment came. Now it had. She walked to the podium. The room leaned in. Annie placed the intern badge on the podium where she could see it, not where the cameras could easily read it. "My name is Annie Carter," she said. "I am 18 years old. I have worked at Whitaker Global for 1 month. Last night I stayed late to finish files and make Mr. Whitaker tea. That is how ordinary the night was before men with iron bars came through the door. No one moved. I know what some people want this to become. They want my father's name to be louder than what I did. They want people to ask whether I belonged in that office instead of asking why armed men thought they could walk into it. They want fear to do the work facts won't do for them. She paused, hearing Denise's voice in her head. Breathe. So she did. I will not pretend my life is simple. It isn't. I will not pretend people do not have questions. They do. But I will not let anyone turn me into a shadow so a guilty man can look clean in the light. A reporter near the front lowered his phone. Annie continued. Mr. Whitaker was kind to me when he thought I was just an intern with nothing to offer him. That matters. People show you who they are when they don't think you can help them or hurt them. Last night, when those men threatened me, he told them to leave me alone. He did that before he knew who my father was. Edward looked down. That is why I stood up for him, Annie said. Not because I am fearless. Not because I wanted attention. Because somebody who had power used it kindly. And somebody without power in that room still had a choice. The room stayed quiet in a way she had not expected. Then questions came. Miss Carter, are you Victor Kane's daughter? Annie looked at the reporter. Yes. Did your father place you at Whitaker Global? No. Did Mr. Kane have business with Mr. Whitaker? Edward stepped forward, but Annie answered first. No, and if anyone has evidence otherwise, they should give it to Detective Hensley instead of hiding behind anonymous emails. A few reporters shifted. Another asked, did you call your father during the attack? Yes. Did he threaten the men? Annie held the reporter's gaze. His voice made them reconsider their life choices. A few restrained laughs moved through the room before Hensley's expression killed them. The reporter pressed, is that an admission of intimidation? No, Annie said. It is an admission that some men only understand fear when it finally points back at them. Edward's mouth tightened, almost a smile. A woman reporter raised her hand. Miss Carter, do you believe race played a role in how the attackers treated you? Annie did not hesitate. Yes, they mocked me as a black girl, as an intern, as someone they thought could be dismissed. That is not separate from the crime. That is part of why they felt safe doing it. The room quieted again. The final question came from a gray-haired man in the second row. What do you want people to remember from last night? Annie looked at Edward, then at Denise, then at Detective Hensley. I want them to remember that the person people overlook may be the person paying the closest attention, she said. And I want them to remember that justice does not start when everyone is comfortable. Sometimes it starts when one person says, no, not this time. The police media officer ended the briefing. As cameras lowered and reporters began shouting follow-ups, Annie stepped back from the podium. Her legs felt unsteady now that the words were over. Denise reached her first and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You did not get me arrested, Denise whispered. I'm proud of both of us. Annie laughed, and this time she did not hide the tears in her eyes. Edward came to stand beside them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The room around them buzzed with aftermath. But the three of them stood in a small quiet made of survival. Evelyn approached with her phone in hand. The board watched. Edward sighed. And? Langford is requesting an emergency session. Of course he is. Evelyn's eyes moved to Annie, then back to Edward. Evelyn Chow, Peter Bishop, and 4 others are backing you publicly. They want a vote to remove Langford from the crisis committee. Edward blinked. Langford? He forwarded Vale's draft to his personal attorney last night before the freeze. The last softness left Edward's face. Annie looked at him. Another door. Edward nodded slowly. Another door. Detective Hensley stepped over. Then we keep opening them. Outside the briefing room, morning had fully reached Chicago. The city was awake now, and so was the truth. The emergency board session began at 11:30 a.m., and by noon, Thomas Langford no longer chaired anything. He did not go quietly. Men like Langford rarely did. He spoke of procedure, optics, fiduciary duty, and reputational exposure. He said Annie Carter's presence near executive operations created questions that could not be ignored. He said Edward Whitaker's judgment had been compromised by emotional distress. He said the board needed stability. Evelyn Chow let him talk for 7 minutes. Then she asked one question. Thomas, why did you forward Martin Vale's draft statement to your personal attorney before the police froze his account? The room changed. Edward sat at the head of the board table with his right hand braced and a cup of tea near his left. He had not wanted tea. Paige had placed it there anyway, then given him a look that reminded him women had been keeping foolish men alive long before corporate governance existed. Annie sat against the wall, not at the table. She had been invited in as a witness for part of the session, and Edward had told her she did not have to stay. She stayed because she was tired of powerful rooms discussing her as if she had no ears. Langford looked from Evelyn to Peter Bishop, then to Edward. "I forwarded it for legal review," he said. "To your personal attorney," Evelyn repeated. In a fast-moving crisis, Bishop said, his southern drawl quieter than usual. "You chose not to send a malicious draft to corporate counsel. Not to Edward, not to police, but to a lawyer who handles your private investments." Langford's face reddened. "Be careful what you imply." Edward leaned forward. "No. Thomas, you be careful what you explain." That ended the performance. By the time Detective Hensley's financial crimes liaison joined by phone, Langford's excuses had begun to fold in on themselves. He claimed confusion, then concern, then privilege. By the end, he had stopped speaking except through a lawyer. The board voted to remove him from all crisis authority pending investigation. They also voted to suspend any committee access connected to Martin Vale's firm, preserve all communications, and create an independent review into Brandon's attempted takeover, Northline development, and any internal help given to the men who entered the building. Edward did not look triumphant. He looked like a man discovering rot in the walls of a house he had built by hand. When the meeting ended, Annie stood to leave. Edward called her name. She turned. Most of the board had already gone, but Evelyn remained near the window, speaking softly into her phone. Bishop was gathering papers with slow, careful movements. Paige stood in the doorway, pretending not to listen and failing. Edward looked at the chair beside him. "Sit for a minute." Annie hesitated, then sat. He slid the cup of tea toward her. "I haven't touched it." "You don't want it?" "I'm afraid Paige will appear from a vent and scold me if I waste it." Annie took the cup with both hands. It was warm, not hot. For a second, she thought of the first cup shattered on the office carpet, of Mason's hand, of Edward coughing under a twisted collar. This cup felt like a small repair, Edward noticed. "We're replacing the carpet." "Good." It smelled like old tea and bad decisions. He smiled faintly. "The desk stays. The one with the scratch?" "Yes." Annie looked toward his office through the glass wall. The door had been replaced temporarily. The desk had been cleaned but not polished. One narrow scar remained on the walnut where Mason's iron bar had struck near the edge. Edward followed her gaze. "I want to remember what almost got signed there. And what didn't." "Yes," he said. "And what didn't?" Evelyn came over, ending her call. "The first wave is stabilizing. Police confirmation helped. The clip of Annie's statement is everywhere." Annie winced. "How bad?" Evelyn gave her a rare smile. "Depends who you ask. Some people are uncomfortable. That usually means the truth landed." Paige stepped in. "Mrs. Alvarez from accounting says if anyone bothers Annie, they'll have to go through payroll first." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Payroll?" Paige nodded. "Apparently they're organized." Annie laughed before she could stop herself. The laugh loosened something in the room. For the rest of the afternoon, the company did what wounded institutions do when decent people are still inside them. It gathered facts. It locked systems. It answered employees before rumors could feed on fear. Edward recorded a short message to staff, not polished, not dramatic. He told them a crime had been committed, that the company was cooperating with authorities, that no employee should harass or speculate about Annie Carter, and that anyone who had information could report it safely. Then he added something not in the draft. "Titles do not determine whose voice matters here. Last night proved that. We will act like we learned it." Evelyn looked up from the printed copy, surprised. Annie looked down at her hands. 3 weeks later, Brandon Whitaker entered a formal plea of not guilty, as his attorneys had promised he would. Martin Vale did the same. Mason Briggs, still in protective custody, began cooperating more than anyone expected. Northline Development received subpoenas. Langford resigned from the board to avoid distraction, which fooled no one but sounded tidy enough for business press. Edward visited Brandon once. Annie did not go. She only heard about it later, from Edward himself, on a gray afternoon when the office smelled of new carpet and rain. He told her Brandon looked smaller behind glass, angry still, frightened too. Edward had not forgiven him. He had not stopped loving him either. "That must be hard," Annie said. Edward looked at the scar on the desk. "It is, but I'm learning love without accountability is just fear wearing a family name." Annie thought of Victor then, and of all the ways love in her own life had arrived with guards, locked cars, and warnings whispered before school events. That evening, she called her father from the quiet stairwell. "Are you safe?" Victor asked, as always. "Yes." "Whitaker treating you well?" "Yes." A pause. "You are still working there?" "For now. You could come work somewhere safer." Annie smiled. "With you?" "I did not say that." "You meant that." Victor was silent long enough to admit it. "Dad," she said, "I don't want a life where everyone is afraid before I enter the room." "I know. I also don't want a life where people think I'm small enough to step on." His voice softened. "Then build the third life." She leaned against the stairwell wall, holding the phone close. "I'm trying." 6 months later, Whitaker Global Holdings looked almost the same from the outside. The same glass tower rose over downtown Chicago. The same elevators opened on the 48th floor. The same coffee station ran out of oat milk by 10 on Mondays. Mrs. Alvarez still knew everyone's medical advice and ignored her own. Mr. Lewis still claimed the copy machines had personalities and grudges. But some things had changed. The internship program had been rebuilt with paid positions, mentorship, and a real reporting channel that did not send complaints into a manager's drawer to die. Security access was audited monthly. Anonymous reporting went to an outside firm. The board added 2 new independent members, both with reputations for asking inconvenient questions. Edward stopped working past 7 unless there was a true emergency. And Paige enforced the rule with the authority of a sheriff. Annie finished her internship in December. On her last official day, snow fell over Chicago in quiet sheets. She expected a card, maybe cupcakes, in the break room. Instead, Edward called her into his office. The scratch on the desk remained. So did a new cup of tea. This time, 2 cups. Annie sat across from him. "If this is another board crisis, I'm charging consultant rates." Edward smiled. "Fair." He slid a folder toward her. She opened it and found an offer letter for Whitaker Global's Young Leadership Fellowship, a paid role designed for students entering college or early professional training. Rotations through operations, legal, community logistics, and ethics compliance. Tuition support, mentorship, real work, not decorative diversity. Annie read the first page twice. Then she looked up. "You're not offering this because of my father, are you?" Edward's answer came without hesitation. "No. I'm offering it because of you." The words were simple. That was why they mattered. Annie looked back at the letter. Her name sat at the top in clean black type. Annie Carter. Not hidden, not rewritten, not attached to anyone else's shadow. Her throat tightened, but she managed to keep her voice even. "I'll think about it." Edward nodded. "You should. That's not the answer you expected. It's the answer I respect." She smiled at that. Outside his office, life moved in ordinary ways. Someone laughed near the elevators. A printer jammed. Paige told a courier he was on the wrong floor. Mrs. Alvarez complained that nobody labeled leftovers anymore because civilization was collapsing. Annie picked up the cup of tea and held it between her hands. "Mr. Whitaker?" "Yes?" "That night, when you told them to leave me alone, you really didn't know who I was." "No. You just thought I was an intern." Edward shook his head. "I thought you were Annie." For a moment, she could not answer. Then she nodded, folded the offer letter, and placed it carefully back in the folder. That evening, Annie left the building through the main lobby. No side door, no black SUV waiting at the curb. She wore her winter coat, carried her canvas tote, and stepped into the cold with snow catching in her hair. Her gold phone rested in her pocket. Her regular phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Denise, asking whether she wanted chili for dinner. A second message came from Victor. "Proud of you. Don't forget gloves." Annie smiled. At the corner, she paused and looked back at the tower. 6 months ago, she had entered it trying to be invisible. Then one night, men with iron bars taught her what invisibility cost. They thought a black girl with an intern badge could be mocked, moved, or made into a lie. They were wrong. Courage had not made Annie fearless. Truth had not made life simple. Justice had not erased pain. Edward still visited his son. Victor was still Victor. The world still judged too fast and apologized too slowly. But something had shifted. A man who could have hidden behind money chose the law. A girl who could have hidden behind fear chose her name. A company that could have protected its image was forced to look at its soul. And a lie scheduled for midnight never got to become the morning. Annie turned toward the train station and walked into the snow. Behind her, high above the city, Edward Whittaker's office light went out before 7. For once, that felt like a victory. The lesson of this story is that we should never judge a person by their age, race, job title, or appearance. Annie was only an 18-year-old intern in the eyes of everyone around her. But when danger entered the room, she became the one person brave enough to stand up for what was right. Edward's kindness to her when he thought she had nothing to offer became the reason she chose to protect him. The story reminds us that quiet respect, honesty, and courage can change the outcome of even the darkest night. Justice may not come easily, but it begins when someone refuses to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.